欢迎您收看智库简报：中国下一代对外投资的 ESG 影响，印尼和柬埔寨。荣鼎咨询。本报告描述了自2017年以来中国全球对外直接投资 OFDA 的变化，并借助东南亚的案例研究，从环境、社会和治理 ESG 的角度分析了这种新一代中国 OFDI 对东道国的影响。基于对2000年至2021年中国区域投资的新数据估计，我们选择了4个投资案例进行研究，并使用多层次的 ESG 框架和开放源报告进行评估。在柬埔寨，我们研究了大规模的达拉萨科尔区和一家新的轮胎制造厂；而在印尼，我们研究了一座地热发电厂和一座镍加工厂，用于下一代电动汽车电池。我们的主要发现是，自2017年以来，中国全球投资发生了巨大变化，总投资已经放缓，可能比官方数据显示的更加明显。地理重点已经从先进经济体转向世界其他地区，尤其是亚洲。在2010年代，并购是中国 OFDI 的主要模式。然而，绿地外商直接投资在近年来成为中国 OFDI 流动的越来越重要的驱动因素。中国对东南亚的投资有所增加，与中国自2016年以来的全球投资趋势相反，并且中国企业正在涉足新的行业。虽然中国在该地区的参与曾经集中在少数几个行业，如房地产和轻工制造业，但柬埔寨和印尼现在正在看到超出这些狭窄行业范围的投资。中国企业在东南亚的投资正从传统行业转向更先进的制造业、关键原材料加工和技术和区域平台业务的投资。这反映了在其他地区，包括拉丁美洲的投资的变化。这些新的模式很可能会继续下去，东道国政府应相应制定计划。随着中国经济的成熟和试图转向基于消费和先进技术的新的国内模式，中国企业可能会在海外进行新的能源密集型制造业投资。随着传统产业的转移，中国公司在替代能源和电动汽车等绿色技术方面的不断增长的专业知识，也将使其能够在这些领域进行新的海外投资，但对接收国的环境影响可能是复杂的。本报告涵盖的4个 ESG 案例研究评估了印尼的 Point QNB 新能源材料和 PT Sorik Merapi 地热发电厂 SMGP， 以及柬埔寨的达拉萨科尔区和 CARD 轮胎有限公司。每个案例都被选中以突出中国对外直接投资在该地区的特点，如金融参与的新领域或中国企业的新可持续发展政策。中国企业越来越关注 ESG 概念，制定 ESG 政策，并经常发布涵盖公司范围的 ESG 活动的报告。然而，这些报告通常缺乏细节和指标。报告通常省略了公司范围的指标，如总碳排放量和项目级数据。相反，公司更有可能报告企业社会责任 CSR 倡议，如对当地学校的捐赠。尽管中国企业在海外经营往往被刻板印象为污染者和劣质劳动实践者，但在我们的案例研究中，中国企业的 ESG 实践和绩效存在相当大的差异。每家公司在 ESG 的某些方面通常表现良好，如社区咨询，但在其他方面表现不佳。达拉萨科尔是一个例外，它在几乎所有的指标上评分都很低。印尼和柬埔寨的东道国背景对 ESG 结果至关重要。我们的案例研究支援之前的研究，表明中国企业在东南亚国家的投资通常符合东道国的最低 ESG 实践要求，包括名义上进行环境和社会影响研究，但通常不会进一步采取行动。尽管中国官方近年来发布了新的自愿绿色投资指南，但实际上，这些公司似乎遵守中国的强制性法律要求，只要符合东道国的法规，即使中国的国内法规可能禁止特定做法。透明度仍然是我们案例研究中公司面临的一个重要挑战。对于我们的案例研究，我们只能通过二手报告验证环境影响评估 EIS 或社会影响评估 CSIS 的完成情况，而且只有某些专案可用。没有任何评估可以通过互联网获得。只有一个专案，柬埔寨的 CARD 轮胎工厂有一个公开可用的可行性研究，这使得很难确定评估的品质，并分析对其建议的遵守情况，有时甚至难以确定它们是否已经完成。缺乏额外的定量数据，包括法律规定的披露， 使得很难确定投资对当地地区的影响，特别是对于占地面积小或属于较大区域的专案。我们的案例研究观察到水域、海洋区域和受保护土地污染的反复问题。我们研究的3个中国投资项目位于敏感或受保护区附近，这些区域似乎没有得到足够的保护。在达拉萨科尔的情况下，受保护土地的法律地位并没有阻止受保护区的开发。印尼的 PTSMGP 地热发电厂也存在类似的情况。即使那些看似促进绿色工业实践或支援绿色技术的专案，如本报告中探讨的电池材料厂和地热发电站，也可能在专案层面上无法支援良好的 ESG 结果。本报告涵盖的电池材料加工和地热发电专案在一个或多个领域的环境表现都很差，凸显了绿色技术发展的潜在副产品和风险。中国和东道国可以采取更多措施来提高参与中国在印尼和柬埔寨的海外投资的所有参与者的能力。这些参与者包括可能负责实施影响评估、可行性研究和专案活动的顾问和承包商。他们还包括印尼和柬埔寨政府和监管机构，这些机构可能资源不足，缺乏明确的法律许可权或执法权利，或者在特定专案上受到政治干预或干涉的破坏。改善公司层面的披露，并包括有意义的定量和定性指标，对于改善 ESG 绩效和促进新的投资至关重要。如果中国政府能够明确界定标准并要求披露，而不是依靠自愿遵守，它很可能会改善海外 ESG 绩效。商业 ESG 数据供应商和公共政策研究人员对中国公司在海外活动的更全面报道，也将有助于促进透明度和提高公众问责性。引言：自2010年以来，中国的对外投资迅速增加，使中国成为世界上最大的外国直接投资来源之一。东南亚，中国现在是该地区最大的单一外国直接投资来源国，深受这一增长的影响。从2000年代初期开始的对低技能制造业和自然资源开采的投资逐渐演变，中国企业在该地区稳步扩大，建立了区域供应链、中国商品和服务的新市场，以及强大的金融和服务网络。与其他国家的对外直接投资一样，新的投资为东南亚东道国带来了机遇和风险。中国的投资有潜力推动经济发展和创新，但也可能对 ESG 结果带来挑战。甚至确定中国企业的投资在哪里也是一个重大的数据挑战，使我们难以了解东道国受到的影响。中国的对外投资正在迅速变化。中国经济优先事项的重大发展，从对绿色发展的新关注到对外投资的更加限制性政策，正在改变中国企业在东南亚的投资地点和方式。虽然以前的投资集中在低技能制造业和资源领域，但最近在该地区的投资包括从替代能源和电动汽车到大数据分析和先进类造业的下一代技术。同时，一带一路倡议和区域全面经济伙伴关系协定促进了在多个背景下的关系。在这种转变背后，中国的新经济政策强调了除了简单经济回报之外的更广泛目标。如今，中国企业在新兴市场运营了几十年，越来越重视 ESG 考虑因素。从上至下，中国政府发布了新的绿色金融指南和政策，以促进外国投资的可持续性。而从下至上，随着 ESG 原则在全球市场中更深入的嵌入，中国企业对其全球影响和企业社会责任倡议的披露也越来越多。本报告在这些变化的背景下，研究了中国在印尼和柬埔寨的投资对 ESG 的影响。首先，我们利用官方数据和一种新颖的交易数据集，跟踪中国企业在这两个国家的投资情况，从2000年到2021年。我们回顾了中国在东南亚的投资模式，并讨论了追踪中国资金流向该地区的挑战。然后，我们回顾了当前的 ESG 状况，包括中国在这两个国家的可持续发展实践，并制定了一个评估中国海外投资 ESG 影响的框架。最后，我们将该框架应用于柬埔寨和印尼的4个最近的中国投资案例，评估中国企业在实践中如何应用 ESG 原则。B142中国对外直接投资的新时代。本节描述了中国全球投资轨迹的演变，并更详细地审视了中国在东南亚的 FDI 足迹，特别是在印尼和柬埔寨。 我们的概述基于官方 FBI 数据以及一种新颖的交易数据集，以解决官方 FBI 统计数据中的空白问题。中国的全球对外直接投资。
观众朋友好，欢迎来到本期思想先驱报。在今天的节目中，我们着重为您介绍2篇关注中国经济的分析文章。首先来看《经济学人》的封面报道。这篇文章的题目是习近平的失败模式，为什么中国经济无可救药？以下是文章主要内容。出了什么问题？自从1978年中国重新加入世界经济后，它成为历史上最引人注目的增长故事。农业改革、工业化和收入的增加使近8亿人摆脱了极度贫困。1980年时，中国经济规模仅为美国的1/10，现在已经接近美国的3/4。然而，在2022年底政府放弃零 COVID 政策后，中国经济并没有强劲复苏，反而一路跌宕。第二季度，经济以仅仅 3.2% 的年化增长率增长，这一失望表现在美国预计将以近 6% 的速度增长的情况下显得更为糟糕。房价下跌，房地产开发商也陷入困境，吓跑了购房者。消费支出、企业投资和出口都未能达标。而在全球大多数地区都在与过高的通胀做斗争的时候，中国却面临相反的问题，消费价格在截至7月的1年里下降。一些分析师警告说，中国可能陷入类似1990年代日本的通缩陷阱。然而，从某些方面来看，把中国的问题诊断为日本化还嫌过于温和。在中国，由于人民更贫穷，长期增长不足的后果会更严重。到1990年，日本的生活水平约为美国的 60%， 而今天的中国不到 20%。而且，与日本不同，中国还面临着比需求不足和债务负担更为深刻的问题。许多挑战源于其经济政策制定的更广泛的失败，这些失败在习近平主席集权的过程中变得越来越严重。10年前左右，中国的技术官僚几乎被视为先知。首先，他们主持了一个经济奇迹。然后，中国是唯一一个以足够的刺激力量应对2007至09年全球金融危机的大经济体。有些评论者甚至说，中国挽救了世界经济。在2010年代，每当经济出现波动时，官员们都能通过降低信贷成本、建设基础设施或刺激房地产市场来挽救局面。然而，在每一次危机中，公共和私人债务都在增加。对房地产繁荣的可持续性以及是否真的需要新基础设施的质疑也在增加。如今，政策制定者陷入了困境。明智的，他们不想再造出更多无用的项目或重新刺激房地产泡沫。他们也无法做足够多的更理想的刺激措施，比如增加养老金支出和向贫困家庭发放救济金以提振消费。因为习近平已经否定了福利主义，政府寻求的官方赤字仅为 GDP 的 3%。因此，对经济放缓的反应一直不温不火。政策制定者甚至不愿大幅度降低利率。8月21日，他们令投资者失望，将1年期贷款利率仅微调了 0.1个百分点。这种对暴跌的增长和通胀的软弱反应是一系列政策失误的最新表现。中国对外政策的咄咄逼人和其重商主义的工业政策加剧了与美国的经济冲突。在国内，政府未能妥善处理推动房地产投机的激励机制，以及房地产开发商背负如此巨大的义务，以至于他们在体系中具有重要意义。从2020年开始，监管机构通过打压被认为过于难以驾驭和垄断的成功消费技术公司而扰乱了市场。在大流行期间，官员们通过封锁来争取时间，但未能有效利用这一时间来为有控制的退出疫情做足够的疫苗接种准备。然后被高度传染性的 Omicron 变种压垮。政府为什么一直犯错误？一个原因是，短期增长不再是中国共产党的首要任务。迹象表明，习近平认为中国必须为与美国的持续经济和可能的军事冲突做好准备。因此，他现在强调中国追求国家伟大、安全和韧性。他愿意为实现这些目标做出物质上的牺牲，而在他追求增长的程度上，这必须是高质量的。然而，即使按照习近平的标准，党的决策也是有问题的。清零政策崩溃削弱了习近平的威望，对科技公司的打压吓跑了企业家。如果中国陷入持续的通缩，因为当局拒绝刺激消费，债务将以实际价值上升，对经济造成更大的压力。最重要的是，除非党能继续提高生活水平，否则它将削弱其对权力的控制， 并限制其与美国竞争的能力。因此，不断增加的政策失败看起来更像是对国家安全的新的自我牺牲的关注，而不是简单的糟糕的决策。这些都与习近平对权力的集中以及他用忠诚的人替换顶级职位中的技术官僚相吻合。中国过去容忍对其经济进行辩论，但现在他强迫分析师进行假装的乐观。最近，他已经停止发布关于青年失业和消费者信心的不容乐观的数据。政府高层仍然有大量的人才，但当来自顶层的信息是忠诚高于一切时，期望官僚机构能够产生理性的分析或富有创意的想法是天真的。相反，决策越来越多地受到一种将对富有企业家的左翼怀疑与对懒惰穷人不愿给予资助的右翼不情愿相结合的意识形态的支配。由于中国的问题始于高层，因此他们将持续存在。随着笨拙的政策制定者面对经济日益增加的挑战，这些问题甚至可能恶化。人口正在迅速老龄化，美国越来越敌对，正试图遏制中国经济的关键部分，比如芯片制造。他认为这些部分在战略上具有重要意义。中国越是迎头赶上美国，进一步缩小差距就越困难，因为集中式的经济更擅长模仿而非创新。自由主义者关于中国的预测常常显示出一厢情愿的想法。在2000年代，西方领导人错误地认为贸易、市场和增长会促进民主和个人自由。但现在中国正在测试相反的关系，更多的专制是否会损害经济？越来越多的证据表明，它确实会，并且在经历了40年的快速增长后，中国正在进入一个令人失望的时期。另外，再来关注《华尔街日报》的一篇分析。6张图表解析中国的信心危机。下面是主要内容。中国当前萎靡不振的原因是什么？答案有很多，从人口状况到地缘政治，再到贸易。但关键问题可能要归结为家庭财务，而且同样重要的是，普通民众对于抗疫风控解除后生活将持续改善的信心发生严重动摇。为什么要特别关注家庭？中国存在严重的债务和生产力问题，尤其是在国有企业和地方政府部门，但多年来一直如此。出口正在下降，但中国以前也经历过贸易滑坡。此外，私营制造业和基础设施投资实际上表现相对较好。与以往不同且值得注意的是，在当前的经济放缓中，居民消费价格、消费、服务业投资和房地产投资都异常疲软。所有这些无疑都指向家庭。家庭消费和承担风险的意愿降低，还会以有害和自我强化的方式削弱经济的其他领域，直接影响消费，间接抑制投资。因为主要以房贷形式存在的家庭借款，长期以来一直帮助资金拮据的房地产开发商和地方政府摆脱困境，转向节俭。一些分析师称，过去10年里，中国家庭债务主要是房贷增长非常迅速。中国家庭债务占可支配收入的比例现在正接近美国2009年以前的水平，但与2009年危机前的美国相比，中国有一个关键的不同之处：中国未面临房贷拖欠潮。中国家庭正在迅速偿还房贷，而且普遍在缩减开支。这种避险情绪升温的背后有很多原因，但中国政府在疫情期间采取的几项关键政策可能起到了推波助澜的作用。尤其是长达3年的动态清零政策破坏了服务业这个就业引擎，而要求房地产开发商去杠杆的整顿行动又迫使房企推迟向家庭交付预售住房。被耍弄。需要明白的关键一点是，中国家庭实际上是房地产开发商的庞大贷款人，而房地产是中国经济的一大支柱。2021年，中国售出的住房中约有 90% 是预售房，意味着开发商向家庭出售了尚未建成的住宅的产权。实质上，中国家庭办理了付息房贷，房地产开发商得到了那些现金，无需支付利息，而购房者换来的是尚未建成的住宅。随后，房地产开发商用这些钱去购买地块进行开发，地方政府则从土地出让中获得收入。要充分认识到买房是一笔多么不划算的买卖，就要考虑到中国的房贷也往往含有追索权。这意味着，即便购房者不还贷，银行仍有权追索购房者的其他资产。2021年，当中国恒大集团等资金紧张的大型房地产开发商开始不能履行交房义务时，一些购房者的反应是离开这个市场并还清债务。2023年上半年，中国个人房贷余额实际上减少了人民币2000亿元，约合280亿美元。就业市场面临艰难时期。 雪上加霜的是，房地产危机爆发之际，中国经济的主要就业引擎服务业此前已经因中国政府的新冠动态清零政策和对互联网平台经济的监管整顿而受到威胁。据一些人估计，该领域约占中国城镇就业岗位的1/4。根据官方数据，在2020年至2022年期间，服务业就业岗位竟减少1200万个。而在2012年至2020年期间，服务业一直是中国全部就业岗位净增长的贡献者，吸收了大多数受过高等教育的毕业生。强劲的出口在一段时间之内掩盖了裂痕，但随着中国终于在2023年初重新开放，新冠疫情时期的出口热潮出现逆转。因此，进入2023年第2季度时，中国的服务业和建筑业元气大伤，制造业的一个引擎也面临停滞不前的威胁。就业市场一直难以持稳，数量创纪录的高校应届毕业生推动青年失业率超过 20%。这些应届毕业生中很多是在2021年和2022年逃离就业市场，选择接受更高程度的教育。信心危机，遭到重创的就业市场和房地产市场带来了普遍的悲观情绪，家庭储蓄远高于新冠疫情之前的水平，民众对进一步增加消费或购房深表怀疑。中国央行对城市银行储户进行的一项长期调查发现，第2季度约有 58% 的受访者表示倾向于增加储蓄存款，这略低于2022年12月的 62%， 但自2019年年中以来上升了近15个百分点。只有 24.5% 的人倾向于增加消费。储蓄存款的实际增长率也居高不下，根据研究咨询公司龙舟精讯数据，3个月的年化增长率超过 15%。相比之下，新冠疫情前的平均增长速度约为 10%。 打破恶性循环，中国经济仍在增长，有工作人士的收入也在增加。但是，只要中国仍然陷于开发商倒闭、房价下跌和家庭心态不稳的恶性循环中，或许就很难抑制经济的下滑态势。这有可能使悲观预期变得根深蒂固，进而导致储蓄增加，经济动能减弱。随着开发商和地方政府以及为其提供资金的银行难以填补家庭缩减开支给融资生态系统留下的缺口，还可能引发金融系统的更大问题。为了打破这一恶性循环，中央政府可能需要调整自身资产负债表，向家庭进行大额财政转移，或间接救助房地产开发商，并扭转一些已使外国投资者和部分国内企业家受到打击的激进监管措施。但目前仍不清楚中国政府是否会采取这些措施。首先，中国政府可能对大规模直接支出持谨慎态度，因为以地方政府债务形式存在的实际负债已然数额巨大。近年来，中国政府投入了大量政治资本，将住房投机、科技巨头影响力过大和依赖外国人的问题描绘成社会弊病。如果现在明确扭转做法，可能带来巨大的政治风险。因为这实际上意味着承认中央领导层的更多标志性政策已经失败。中国的问题到底是模式失败还是信心危机呢？请告诉我们您的看法。以上就是本期思想先驱报全部内容，谢谢您的观看。
Today's event serves to launch the Scowcroft Center's newest Atlantic Council strategy paper, Global Strategy 2023, Winning the Tech Race with China, authored by Peter Engelke and Emily Weinstein, and published in partnership with the Global China Hub. Since the end of World War II, the United States has been the world's technology leader. This innovation edge has provided the United States with substantial geopolitical, economic, and military advantages for decades. As we enter a contested era of strategic competition, however, the Chinese Communist Party has made controlling the commanding heights of 21st century technology a top priority, and it may already enjoy an edge over the United States and its democratic allies in several key technology areas. As the world faces mounting geopolitical challenges, the stakes of the new tech race could not be greater for defending the U.S.-led rules-based system that we've enjoyed for the past several decades. This report seeks to address a central key question: how can the United States and its allies and partners maintain their innovation edge? This report is the culmination of over a year's worth of work and research, complete with several workshops and 3 shorter strategic insights memos published on this topic. The paper launched today outlines a 3-part strategy: promote, protect, and coordinate. First, the United States and its allies and partners need to promote their own vast innovation ecosystem, establishing cohesion between the public and private sectors, as well as expansion of the country's research and development capabilities in order to catch up to our greatest competitors. Second, they need to protect and defend the country's science and technology knowledge and capabilities from malign actors through the use of trade controls, sanctions, investment screenings, and a vast array of other policy tools. Third and finally, they need to coordinate, building and sustaining relationships with other countries in and around the tech strategy and policy space. Convenings like this are central to the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies and partners. The Center honors General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. We're fortunate today to be joined by a distinguished panel of speakers with various multidisciplinary insights on the nuanced topic we're tackling today. Today we're joined by Charles Barnett, Vice President, China and Transformational Exports Programs from the Export-Import Bank of the United States, Brendan Groves, Vice President of Regulatory and Policy Affairs from Skydio, Emily Weinstein, a non-resident Senior Fellow with the Global China Hub here at the Atlantic Council, and a Research Fellow with the Georgetown University Center for Security and Emerging Technology, Helen Zhang, co-founder, Intrigue Media, and today's panel will be moderated by Kate Marino, business editor at Axios. To follow the conversation online, please be sure to follow our Scowcroft Center on Twitter at AC Scowcroft. To read the full report and the strategic insights memos that preceded it, be sure to check out the Scowcroft Strategy Initiative webpage on the Atlantic Council website. So thank you again very much for joining, and now I'd like to introduce one of the co-authors of the report, Dr. Peter Engelke, to provide framing remarks and an overview of the report. So Peter, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Matt. So as Matt said, yes, my name is Peter Engelke, and I am the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow for Foresight here at the Atlantic Council, and I am the co-author with Emily Weinstein of the report being launched today, and that is the purpose of this event. So I'd like to begin actually with the story, and that story is that imagine that it is the year 2033, not 2023, so a decade into the future. Imagine that China has made enormous strides forward in the technology arena at the expense of the United States and its allies and partners. Suppose further that this outcome occurred because between now, 2023, and 2033, China became increasingly capable in technological development and innovation. Suppose, too, that the U.S. government failed to enhance its world-leading tech creation machine, its innovation ecosystem, to stay ahead of China. Suppose that the U.S. government also failed to properly calibrate the measures that are designed to prevent China from acquiring best-in-class technologies from elsewhere in the world, including from the United States. And finally, suppose that the United States and its allies and partners around the world failed to align strategies and policies regarding how to engage China in the S&T space. So the question then becomes, what might this world look like? Well, in 2033, I think the first thing we'd notice is that the U.S. scientific and technological advantage, which Matt referred to, an advantage that the U.S. has enjoyed from 1945 down to the present day, that advantage has come to an end. In its place would be a world where China's research labs, its universities, and its firms are often the first to announce breakthrough scientific developments and are often the first to turn those breakthroughs into valuable technologies. So in 2033, you can imagine the consequences. The first of these, perhaps the biggest, would be geostrategic. China would be able to employ weaponry as advanced, perhaps even more advanced than the United States and its allies and partners. And for the geostrategists and the people who focus on geopolitics, think about what that would mean for the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere in the world. But this would not be the only headache in the year 2033. In 2033, or by 2033, many of China's tech firms would be outcompeting tech firms elsewhere in the world. The world will look as much to Shenzhen as to Silicon Valley for the latest tech-infused products and services. In this scenario, China's longstanding ambition to give its tech firms an advantage would have paid off. Its trading practices that have been honed over decades, including massive state subsidies, suspect acquisition, often outright theft of intellectual property, and forced tech transfer to China, will have given Chinese firms an edge in markets all over the world. In many places, China will have grown into the biggest market player, selling its technologies at prices that undercut its rivals. And for this reason, even the biggest Western tech firms would struggle to keep pace with Chinese firms. In sector after sector, in 2033, China would be capturing an increasingly large share of global wealth. Nor is even this fairly long now, gloomy list of things all that has happened between the year 2023 and 2033. The democratic world, for example, has found it impossible in 2033 to realize its preferences concerning the global governance of technology. Collaboration between China on the one hand and Western states on the other used to be a pillar of global science. In 2033, unfortunately, much of that collaboration has disappeared, and the world has been unable to agree on the basic norms and principles that should guide advanced technological development in areas like AI or biotechnology. As a result, big gaps have appeared in how the major players approach such development. Countries, firms, and even individual labs have forged ahead without common ethical normative frameworks to guide R&D. If we were to look back from the year 2033, one of the reasons why China became so dominant was because the U.S. and its allies and partners failed to pursue a coherent, cooperative, and united strategy vis-a-vis China. Various multilateral forums were created for engagement on strategy and policy questions among the United States and its allies and partners, but they proved of low utility as policy harmonization bodies or for tech trade dispute mechanisms. In summary, in 2033, the outlook is pretty bleak. China's S&T capabilities are outstripping its adversaries and competitors across many or even most areas. And of course, there are enormous consequences across geopolitics, economic society, politics, and governance. So let me now stop this story. Let me stop with this scenario and return to the present day. None of the things that I have described have actually occurred. But the scenario that I have just described also is a very plausible one, in that China might become the world's clear S&T leaders by the 2030s. If that were to happen, there would be profound consequences, only some of which I've described. And this is the major reason why we at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center and the Global China Hub conducted this year-long effort. We did so because we wanted to ask some really big questions about this technology competition between the U.S. and China, what we've called a tech race, between the U.S. and its allies and partners on the one hand, and China on the other hand. This race is exceedingly complex. It is multifaceted and even at times contradictory, which is why it's so difficult to get your arms around. Until recently, the U.S. was the undisputed leader in the development of breakthrough technologies and in the innovation and commercial scaling of emerging and existing technologies. And until very recently, and I emphasize very recently, China was a laggard in both of those things, in science and in innovation. That script clearly has changed. China is now the greatest single challenger to U.S. preeminence in this space. So given the salience of this competition, we assert that the U.S. should have three strategic goals. The first is to preserve advantage in technological development and innovation relative to China. The second is to harmonize U.S. strategy and policy with those of our allies and partners while gaining favor with non-aligned states. And the third is to retain international cooperation around global public goods, including but not limited to trade and technology, and in scientific research and exploration. To achieve these strategic goals, we argue that the U.S. should pursue a three-pronged strategy, what Matt referred to in his opening remarks, sometimes called promote, protect, and coordinate. We should promote technologically based innovation here in the United States. We need to do a number of things to ensure that our innovation ecosystem is doing better than it is even now. We need to protect strategically valuable S&T know-how, processes, machines, and technologies. And we need to coordinate closely with allies and partners. So let me go to the promotion side. On the promotion side, the U.S. government, in partnership with state and local governments, the private sector, and academia, will need to reposition and recalibrate its policies and investments to build out and strengthen its innovation ecosystem. On the protect side, the U.S. government needs to smartly deploy its range of tools, including trade controls, sanctions, investment screening, and more, to protect the most sensitive S&T knowledge and capabilities. And on the coordination side, which we might call tech diplomacy, the U.S. needs to ensure that its strategies and policies positively influence as many allies, partners, and even non-aligned states as possible, while continuing to engage with China. The difficulty, of course, as you can imagine, lies in squaring the many interests and priorities of the United States with those of its allies and partners, with those of non-aligned states, and even with those of China itself. Now, no strategy is without risk, and ours presents a couple of major sets of risks in pursuing a strategy that we map out. One risk is overreach from decoupling, sometimes called decoupling, often called decoupling, I should say, to preserve geopolitical advantages, which often contradicts economic interests, including our own economic interests and those of our allies and partners. And we're seeing that being played out in the news all the time. A second risk is the harm that this competition might inflict on global public goods provision, including a failure to continue cooperation surrounding S&T research. That's important because international S&T cooperation is critical for solving global problems, for example, climate change. In a final section to our report, which I hope obviously all of you will read, we offer 10 recommendations to policymakers as follows. First, to restore and sustain public R&D funding for scientific and technological advancement in the United States. Second, improve and sustain STEM education and skills training in the United States. Third, craft a more diverse and inclusive tech sector. Fourth, attract and retain highly skilled talent from abroad. Fifth, support whole of government tech strategy development. Sixth, ensure private sector firms remain at the cutting edge of global competitiveness. There's a suite of policies that are relevant in that one recommendation. Seventh, improve S&T intelligence and counterintelligence vis-a-vis China. Eighth, ensure calibrated development and application of punitive measures. Ninth, build out and sustain robust multilateral institutions that are focused on this tech race. 10th, engage with China as it cannot be avoided. Now, that last recommendation is important. The tech race with China is not now, and hopefully never will become, a zero-sum competition. The United States, our allies and partners, non-aligned states, and China all have much to gain from trade and exchange in scientific and technological knowledge, goods, and services. But they also have much to lose, and we have to remember that. So having said that, I'd like now to turn to introduce Kate Marino, who is the business editor at Axios and the moderator of our panel for the next part of our event. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Peter. I'm Kate. I'm business and markets editor at Axios. And to kick it off, I'll just have all of our panelists introduce themselves and talk a little bit about how you come to this topic. Start with Emily.
Sure. I'm Emily Weinstein, and as Matt said earlier, I am a non-resident fellow here at the Atlantic Council in the Global China Hub. I spend my full-time job over at Georgetown University at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology. I, as a co-author of this piece, come to this issue as someone who's studied China for a while now. I started my career, I should say, as someone who wanted to bring the U.S. and China together. Obviously, one person can't do that, and I think a lot of us who initially got into China studies over the past few decades really wanted to be that bridge. But now it's about mitigating what's happening with the relationship. So focusing on science and technology, obviously, is a really important piece of the U.S.-China relationship. Obviously, it's one of many. But Peter and I spent the past year really trying to dig into the specifics of as he mentioned, this three-pronged approach, this promote, protect, and coordinate, which we think is the best way to go about navigating our relationship with China in a way that is, as Peter alluded, not pushing us towards something that is more zero-sum.
Thanks. Brendan?
Morning, everyone. I'm Brendan. I lead global policy and regulatory at Skydio. We're the largest U.S. domestic drone manufacturer and AI company at our core. We also wake up every day in the trenches of tech competition with China for reasons we'll discuss later. So I approach this problem set both with my private sector hat on, but also with my former government hat on as well. I most recently served as Associate Deputy Attorney General at the Justice Department for National Security, where I oversaw this line of work across the department, both the use of, especially the use of protect tools that involved export controls, counterintelligence operations to identify the threat and take actions accordingly, hopefully in a way that was harmonized across the government and with our allies and partners. So thanks again for having me today.
Charles?
Thanks. My name's Charles Barnett, and I work on Exim Bank's China and Transformational Exports Program team. And for those of you who don't know what Exim is, it's the U.S. government's export credit agency, and we provide financing for U.S. goods being sold abroad. The team I work on came about with our 2019 reauthorization, and the purpose, it's a congressional mandate that was given to Exim, and the mandate said to Exim, one, it's a two-part mandate to help U.S. companies who are competing with Chinese companies abroad to be more effective, and secondly, to focus on transformational export areas, some of which we'll talk about a little bit today. Like Emily, I got my start I worked in China in the private sector for almost 10 years with the idea that we would bring our two countries rather together through trade and a happier bilateral relationship But we find ourselves in a different situation today. Anyway, thank you very much.
Helen?
Very much so. Thank you, Emily, for your report, and also Peter, great job. I am Helen Zhang. I'm the co-founder of Intrigue Media. I spent most of my career as an Australian diplomat, so I've always seen the US-China relationship from that Indo-Pacific angle. And so Intrigue Media produces a daily expert but irreverent briefing on global affairs. So my approach to this is really through a nuanced take on what it is that's going on behind the US-China landscape, beyond sort of technology, supply chains, and geopolitics.
Great. All right, well, just to set the table, let's kind of build on the picture that Peter painted for us by talking about just what's at stake in this tech race from all of your unique vantage points. Charles, you want to start it off?
Sure. So, working at Exim, I've been there for better part of 2 decades, and we've watched this challenge grow over time. We've seen that U.S. companies who are competing for sales abroad have started to face increasingly highly competitive, I would say concessional in some cases, financing and opaque financing provided by the PRC for Chinese companies who are competing in these third countries. And Exim spends billions of dollars a year. We support, I should say, billions of dollars a year in U.S. exports. But we find that U.S. firms increasingly are at a competitive disadvantage when they run up against competition from Chinese state-backed companies. And again, it was within that context that the program I work on was mandated to Exim.
Helen?
Yeah, I think, for me, a lot of the thinking when I think about this is sort of how the allies are thinking about this. And I know we talked about this in sort of the coordinate point. But I think for example, from the Australian perspective, a lot of what's happened seems like the US is on the back foot because Australia's been watching this for the last 10 years and saying that China's not a rising power, it's already here. And so I think from where I sit in the US now, this conversation seems quite familiar and yet more urgent.
Emily?
And I would say, the biggest things that I see in terms of what's at risk are, first, global science, global S&T progress in general. I think science is only better when we all can collaborate. And if there are countries like China, and China's not the only one here, that are trying to reshape these norms in global science and scientific collaboration and cooperation to fit their own agenda, it's a lose-lose scenario for everyone. China doesn't get to advance in science, and we don't get to advance in science. And I say we as this kind of collective we. I think the other thing, too, briefly, just to mention, is this idea of first-mover advantage in emerging technologies. I don't want to put too much emphasis just on emerging technologies. I think, for instance, everyone's talking about semiconductors. Semiconductors are not necessarily an emerging technology, but with emerging technologies like AI and quantum and some things in the biotechnology field as well, first mover advantage has both obviously a military connotation. When we think about quantum encryption, whoever gets there first really gets to set the stage. But first mover advantage from the economic side, I think we're seeing with the conversations around AI right now, can have massive implications, I think, for companies, for education, for all aspects of society. And I think whoever is getting there first and is able to control the playing field is going to really be able to change the trajectory of how we use these technologies globally.
Okay, may I just add something to that idea? One of the things so from the kind of parochial perspective of a US government agency that's very regulation and rules bound, what we've seen is that our counterparts in China, China Exim Bank, Sinosure, and China Development Bank, and other state-owned enterprise banks who operate in a gray area that's very similar to what their official export credit banks do. They used to be an outlier, these banks. They used to operate in a way that was very unusual compared to OECD members like Exim Bank. Our counterparts in Western Europe, in Australia, in Canada, in Japan, Korea. And what we've seen, though, is that they're increasingly, these Chinese entities, these organizations, they're kind of a bellwether. Because the problem you have is that we've found, if you play by the rules that were put into place for good reason, and you abide by those rules, it's very challenging to compete against an actor that doesn't, that understands the rules very well but can operate outside of them, and who makes its financing much more attractive to foreign buyers who have to make a choice. Do they go with the ESG compliant, technically more competent model when they're doing a new project, or do they go with the quick money without the strings attached to that quick money being immediately apparent to them?
Yeah, so that's a really important point, is the kind of unlevel playing field. So I'd like to hear some examples, from the trenches, so to speak, of where we see this playing out, or where you all see this playing out kind of on the ground. And maybe Brendan, that's a good question to start off with you.
Great. So this will put some meat on the bones. I can throw out 2 case studies of 2 totally different technology sectors to set the scene. The first is the LiDAR space, probably not the sector that you thought I would mention, or a sector that you commonly hear referred to in forums like this, but we should be discussing, and here's why. The United States invented LiDAR. It actually surfaced in the DARPA Grand Challenge some years ago, before smart cities, before autonomous vehicles became in vogue. But LiDAR, of course, is the core enabling technology. Well, there's just one problem. A Chinese company called Hesai, within the span of the last 4 to 5 years, has actually displaced the US globally leading companies and taken about 60% of the market share. And if you believe public legal filings, that didn't happen by accident. They've been subject now to 2 complaints that allege that they achieved their market leading position through patent infringement. This really matters for American competitiveness because LiDAR is a core enabling technology. It's part of the Made in China 2025 policy, which is why Hesai has had capital dumped into it and has leveraged this arguably patent infringement to surpass US companies. But it matters for the future of our cities, our streets, and our country. This is a dual use technology. The second example is drones. This is an interesting sector with, I think, a sobering story to tell about the tech competition and the reality of it. Right now, companies based in China and subsidized by the state control roughly 90% of the domestic and global marketplace. That's ironic because just like LiDAR, the US virtually invented this sector. The US pioneered both the development and the deployment of much larger aircraft principally used for military purposes. But the Chinese government realized long before others, certainly including the US, that these very small, smart drones that looked more like toys would soon become critical tools used to inspect infrastructure at scale and to enable maneuvers and life-saving missions on the battlefield. As a result, they leveraged military-civil fusion to pour capital into domestic national champion companies that dumped products, not according to my words, but according to the Department of Defense, into the United States, that displaced and in fact destroyed dozens of American and allied companies. And they now have this dominant position. Compare and contrast that 90% market share, of which 70 to 80 is in the hands of one company, DJI, with Huawei. Huawei had less than 20% of the rural telecom market in the US. What that means is that a company like DJI is more resistant to policy tools. And there have been a variety of policy tools deployed. But when you dominate the market in a manner like that, it makes it much harder for the US and its partners to exert protect tools, much less promote tools, in a way that maximizes competition and restores some equilibrium in the marketplace.
Charles, examples from the trenches?
Examples from the trenches. The phrase that I've seen used that I think is accurate is when you talk about a juggernaut economy and the behavior that of China and the behavior it exhibits, people calling it China Inc. And I've sort of 2 examples to sort of lean on or that speak to, Brendan, what you were mentioning. One is related to Huawei and wireless communications, where obviously the telecom sector, excuse me, in America has shrunk over time. And it's ironic, too, because it's another one of these areas where both original telco but wireless communications, where the U.S. was very dominant for many years. One of the issues that we found is, so XIM's role is to support U.S. companies exporting. How do you make a government agency like that operate in this space and help? If the manufacturers of the goods are not domiciled in America and you're competing against Huawei, how do you provide an alternative, right? So the way, and as a backdrop to that, historically XIM supports goods that goods or services that originate from the United States. This January, I beg your pardon, we revised our content policy for wireless communications for 5G such that we could support safe and trusted vendors who have operations in the United States, but who are their headquarter domicile is not in the United States. And why is that important? Because if you're going to compete, again, if you're going to use a government tool to provide alternatives to foreign buyers, you need to be able to stand behind your words and provide, for example, a financing alternative to China XIM, lending to a telco in a third country where they've made the financing so attractive that even when companies and countries hear warnings about the security and reliability of the Huawei solution, they're forced to make that choice between the financing they do or don't have. So in a specific example, in May of this year, we approved a $300 million preliminary commitment for Costa Rican telco company for its purchase of telco equipment so long as there was a U.S. export nexus of some kind. And so that policy adaptation in January allowed for us to have a concrete export support, or hopefully will in the future, so that companies like the Costa Rican telco company can look to alternatives of Huawei or ZTE.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I might jump on that. I think that's a fantastic example. And one thing, I want to say two things, which is I think, firstly, to begin with, often companies and countries look at the two sort of balance sheets or term sheets that are offered with like the Western model and the Chinese model, and one is unfortunately short-term, much more attractive, which is the Chinese term sheet, right? But I want to say two good things, which is that, firstly, last year at the International Telecommunications Union, ITU, it's a bit of a mouthful to say, there was a good news story coming out of that because the US candidate actually won for the first time, and I think that was really important in setting international standards for telecommunications as well as S&T. Secondly, I want to mention the Quad, which is, I think, something that, you know, Australia is involved in, Japan, India, and the US. And that is a really great example of something that is an opt-in sort of quadrilateral alliance that brings a lot of coordinated strategies to resolving some of these big tech challenges that all those countries face, including clean networks of 5G, 6G, investor networks on dual-use technology, as well as actual undersea cables and the technologies that are underpinning that structure in the Indo-Pacific. So I know there's a competition. I know there's a lot of things that we need to be concerned about. There are also good things that are happening on the ground from the trenches.
Great. And so let's move to some of the recent actions by the U.S. and its allies to start to try to address this. And let's talk about some of the successes and also failures of some of these efforts. Emily, you want to take that?
No, I'm happy to. I mean, hard to judge, I would say, the total success or failure of some of these since they are so new. But I think what the U.S. government has been doing with semiconductors in particular has been very interesting, because I think it's one of our first examples in, I would say, the past few decades in kind of the post-war, post-Cold War era, where we see a quasi-industrial policy coming out here, where we actually see both these promote, protect, and coordinate policies happening simultaneously on the same topic. So, for instance, we had on the protect side the October 7th export controls in 2022 that really tried to limit China's access to U.S. origin advanced node semiconductors and the equipment used to manufacture those. And just a few months before that, we had the passage of the Chips and Science Act here that really was trying to inject as much money and money and kind of policy guidance into the semiconductor industry, both in the U.S. and in conjunction with allies as well. And I think that's kind of a great example of promote and protect working together. But we also have these little pockets of coordination separately. So, for instance, if you look at President Modi of India was recently here in the United States, and as part of the conversation he had with President Biden, there was a conversation about the semiconductor workforce and kind of trying to stand up some more manufacturing capacity for semiconductors in India. You see conversations happening with Japan and South Korea. Semiconductors were a big part of the conversation with the G7 as well. So you see all of these different things happening in coordination. And again, hard to say whether or not it's a success or failure, but I think the fact that we've gotten to this point is arguably a success.
Mm-hmm. Charles?
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's overwhelming response from, I can give you a couple big and small examples, but I would say before I do, just an exuberant and very enthusiastic response on the part of our government and governments all over the world. You know, I was thinking about there's a U.S.-Australian compact for clean energy and climate change that was just signed a few weeks ago with a push towards a lot of what I do, which is critical minerals feeding into the battery supply chain. So that's sort of a bigger bilateral, obviously the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, the
IPEF as well in the region for trade. Yeah. That's very important.
Yeah, there's a partnership for global infrastructure and investment that it's a G7 kind of response to basically the BRI and an attempt to find ways to support projects in a way that meet sort of more transparent financing and funding standards within more parochial, more within a smaller example. At Exim, we created something called, it came out of the 100-day supply chain analysis in the first year of this Biden-Harris administration, Make More in America initiative, which was set up to complement other agencies.
What is it called again? Make More American?
It's a mouthful as well. Okay. Make More in America.
Oh, Make More in America.
MMIA.
Put that on a t-shirt.
Yeah.
We're entering acronym territory.
Yes. I'll try to refrain from doing too much of the acronyms. It's an attempt to, and complement other government programs like the DOE's, Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office, where there's a need for financing in battery supply chain, in pharma, in semiconductors, but we've unsuccessfully reshored those jobs. And for Exim to do what we normally do overseas, but here domestically, which is to finance larger projects, infrastructure, greenfield projects, where there needs to be a brand new build out and an actual project financing, which we've never done before. So just to step back again for a moment, I would say, again, a lot of enthusiasm. Is there a need for more coordination? Absolutely. But I think it's a good start.
Okay, so let's dig in on industrial policy for a second, and then we'll talk about the cooperation and coordination topic, which is also big. But Emily mentioned industrial policy, and that was once kind of a dirty word in Washington, but it's gained some level of bipartisan acceptance lately. Are there tensions between calls for action and the U.S.'s kind of historical stance of staying out, at least somewhat staying out of the private sector? And how can the U.S. responsibly promote technological leadership while avoiding PRC-style, top-down, prescriptive planning? Brendan?
It's a great question, and one that's highly pertinent to policymakers in both parties now. When people think about capital I industrial policy, I think they immediately conceive of heavy-handed supply-side measures designed to promote and even protect domestic manufacturers. And these are the kinds of policies that do raise natural tensions with the free markets and natural tensions, in fact, with our allies and partners around the world. But there is another way. Supply-side measures are not the only way to go about promoting American competitiveness in a responsible manner. There are also demand-side measures. This is maybe an underutilized tool that has a lot of promise if wielded well. And by demand-side measures, I mean measures designed to support not manufacturers, but end users. And those take a couple of forms. They could take the form of tax credits. The EV tax credit is arguably an example of demand-side measures. They can take the form of tailored federal grants for end users. And there are a couple of features of these demand-side programs that commend them. One is that they maximize public choice naturally, right? The market is doing the choosing. Now, maybe the market is directed by the grant program that thou shalt choose a product or service manufactured and engineered in the United States, but the market ultimately is still doing the choosing from one of among a number of options. And the second is that demand-side measures can clearly signal to private investors the market opportunity. And that has the effect of enabling a 2-for-1 special. So for a relatively low level of government investment, you can multiply that, with oftentimes a far larger investment on the part of the private sector that sees the opportunity and doubles down on it, thereby amplifying limited public dollars to serve a larger public and private purpose. So I do think it's important to disaggregate industrial policy, to break it down and to understand that there are some smarter, more nimble, more agile ways to achieve American competitiveness without necessarily trampling on free market principles.
And Charles, from the government perspective, how do you think about industrial policy and interventions?
I think I tend to agree with Brendan. I think and I certainly, I agree with the way you framed it in your question, which is tensions do exist. The struggle is real, for sure. And I think those tensions are fine. I think before we embark on changing how we operate, it's probably a good idea to listen to the skeptics and to listen to those people who question, why an industrial policy for this or for that, whether it's supply or demand pull or whatever it might be. I heard a great interview with Greg Ip on public radio a few months ago, in which he described the CHIPS Act, and he was actually very supportive of the CHIPS Act, and he had some he had some thoughts about it as well. I mean, he for one thing, he said the reason that the moonshot, the Kennedy moonshot, or the vaccine programs have been successful is often because they were not prescriptive. They are broad policy measures that encouraged achieving an end goal that was clear and definable. I would say that the other idea is the U.S. government should always be careful when it's setting policies not to choose winners and losers. I think the comment Ip made about the CHIPS Act, I think, is relevant to that as well. Basically, the funding that goes into this act will probably, it won't encourage bad companies to make bad decisions. The semiconductor manufacturers are very well-established companies. They just don't make they don't make the stuff here anymore. And so if the CHIPS Act encouraged them to reshore here, and they have to make an economic business decision, but it's worth their while to reshore here, then I think it's a successful policy. It's done its job. What happens in the future, that's another policymaker's decision.
And Emily, how do you look at this tension? And have your views changed or kind of evolved over the year of working on this project?
No, it's been fun to watch. And I will say of all of the years to do a project like this, this one has definitely kept us on our toes, which again has been exciting to say the least. But I think one of the things that's really interesting to watch is on both sides of the aisle in Congress. You see everyone kind of grappling with where to take some of these policy directions. And you see certain sides of both the Republican and Democratic parties going in directions that may have seemed contrary to their own party. For instance, I mean, the Republican side, and it's, outbound investment, I think the conversations around an outbound investment screening regime are relatively bipartisan now. I know the Biden administration has been working on an executive order, and we've been waiting for that imminent executive order for, I think, about 8 months now. But for instance, one of the strongest advocates for an outbound investment screening regime has been Senator Cornyn, a Republican from Texas. If you think about, the idea of a Republican calling for, something to restrict investment, and it's a very weird thing to see. But it's kind of the tensions on both sides of the party between, your traditional party values and kind of how you view competition with China. Do you view it as this big, I hate to use the term existential threat, but if you do view it as this big threat, how do you go about shaping that narrative within your own party? And I think it's been really interesting. And the Biden administration, I think, has also shown some of that too, where I think they came in and, a lot of the Trump administration era policies have stayed put. They might have been fine-tuned or kind of adjusted here and there, but for the most part, we've stayed on the same trajectory when it comes to tech competition with China. So I think it's really interesting to see from a domestic political perspective how different parties are kind of grappling with this. And obviously industrial policy is the big one, where I think everyone initially was scared of the term, but now, particularly in light of the Chips and Science Act, I feel like most people are, at least they don't, outwardly cringe when you say the word now. It's at least somewhat more welcomed in policy circles.
So let's move on and talk about cooperation with allies, which is very crucial but very difficult. What are some of the challenges and dynamics that you're seeing, Helen, in your work with cooperation?
I mean, that's a great question. I want to jump on a point that Brendan had mentioned earlier about sort of the demand side and end user tax credits for EVs. So what we saw there was actually, it ended up, when that came through, it ended up upsetting some of our European and South Korean allies. And so you realize that there's actually a balancing act that you always need to be aware of. And for a lot of allies who are in this space, it's really difficult to keep up with some of the US's changing policies. And so zooming back, sorry, I think I got something in my throat. But zooming back on that, I think what the allies like to see is a sort of sustained strategy that is bipartisan and will survive across several administrations. And that's really difficult because I think even though the Trump years was, 4 years ago, more than 4 years ago now, it rattled a lot of the European as well as Indo-Pacific allies, particularly those in Southeast Asia, who I think have had to sort of live with China setting the agenda in that region. So I think that would be a really, I think what we're seeing now is a little bit more coordinated, and I think, as Emily rightly said, a lot more bipartisan support for the long-term strategic goals of the US, and I think that's a welcome change in the region. And having mechanisms and sort of whether bilateral or regional or multilateral mechanisms that perpetuate that will be a really good thing going forward.
And if I could just add something really quickly, I think one of the interesting pieces of this too is I think other parts of the world, and you alluded to this when you mentioned Southeast Asia, are still grappling with trying to not pick sides when it comes to dealing with the U.S. and China and this ongoing competition. And I think because of that, we're seeing a lot more of these plurilateral, bilateral type institutions popping up instead of larger multilateral organizations or even de facto organizations. I mean, think about the Allied response to the invasion of Russia, where we had about 38, 40, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where we had about, the weekend is haunting me still. Where we had very quickly almost 40 countries sign on to impose similar controls on Russia. I don't think if God forbid, a similar situation happened vis-a-vis China and perhaps Taiwan, I don't think we'd see the same response for a whole host of reasons. But I think we're in a point now, and I think the Biden administration is doing a good job at this, in going for these kind of pocket both geographic kind of pockets, as well as these topic-specific pockets instead of just one big, people have called for an economic NATO or things like that. Instead of these big organizations, we're doing things like the US-EU Trade and Technology Council that's very much focused on trade and technology. We have AUKUS with Australia and the UK, where we're very much focused more on the military side of things. And I think doing that is helping to bring perhaps more allies on board, because it's not putting them necessarily in a position where they have to pick sides, but they can be a little bit more flexible.
It's more like a la carte, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what the world is moving towards. I think everyone in Southeast Asia understands that it's a multipolar region now. Yeah. And so in some ways they've got the choice, but then also the US offering has to be much more attractive. So. Yeah.
I would add, I think that has to be, at the end of the day, the alternative needs to be relatively painless, and it has to work. I mean, I think that's the Chinese government's success story the last 20 years has been that when it went into markets and made money available to develop projects in those countries, they made it easy. Yeah. I mean, at least at first, not without challenges later. And I think your comment before, Helen, about the like the life cost of a project versus the upfront, seemingly less expensive China EXIM model versus a Western or a Japanese Korean financing model, which seem more complicated, had more strings attached. Yeah. I think oftentimes these countries look back in hindsight and say, maybe that wasn't such a great idea. If I may, I would just give two examples where at the bilateral level, we've had some success, and at least from EXIM's point of view. One was with Australia, with Export Finance Australia, who's our counterpart there, and the other has been with Canada, particularly with the government in Quebec, but with the broader Canadian government. These are two countries with lots of critical minerals that we're looking to find ways for, if you're a Ford or you're a Tesla or you're a GM and you want to if Ford wants to build 3 new battery factories, for example, they'll need the stuff that goes in those batteries, right? And so where do you get that from? And we've noted with both these governments, they have the same reaction that we do, which is the mining sector is hard. It's not always popular. There's an article this morning in the news about a lithium mine in the West that's on First Nation Native American land. So how do you reconcile that with the challenge at hand? No matter how much we all want to have battery factories, the supply response to that demand is very slow in mining. And so that's one area where we feel like if the U.S. with its allies, with the Australians, the Canadians, or other allies and friendly countries can crowd in by making some of the financing more attractive at the outset, crowd in that private investment, then we can back off again. And then the mines will be successful, hopefully, and support this battery supply chain. I mean, so I think there is hope.
Emily, how is China viewing these recent actions from the U.S. and allies of waking up to what's happening?
It's been fun to watch the Chinese reaction too, because I don't think it's exactly what I expected it to be. Everyone over the past 5-10 years has been watching the buildup of this wolf warrior diplomacy. Everyone's thinking of Zhao Lijian and some of these big kind of wolf warrior leaders that were in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who often had big, very inflammatory statements about U.S. policy. But in a lot of cases, particularly as it relates to some of the U.S. policies over the past year or so, particularly actually since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China has been relatively more subdued than maybe some folks expected them to be. Some people have been arguing that the latest action against Micron, the memory chip company, is perhaps the first in a series of retaliatory measures. Hard to say, exactly why Micron, why now. But for the most part, I think China is doing a little bit of sitting back and biding its time. I think there is opportunity, maybe particularly as it relates to allies and partners, actually more on the non-aligned countries, for China to watch and see as the U.S. continues to throw all of these policies out, if it pushes countries in a direction perhaps closer to China, and this gives China an opportunity to pull some folks onto its side, not again that this is zero sum, but gain some favor with some other folks. So I think China is somewhat enjoying a little bit of a second mover advantage when it comes to deploying some of these policies, at least the outward facing ones. Within China, I mean, there's a lot of efforts to, improve basic science, do these things that they've been doing for a long time. Back to Made in China 2025, doing a lot of things, pushing towards indigenization, self-sufficiency, all of that's still happening. But in terms of how China wants to go about enacting pain, perhaps, on the United States, we've seen them start to try to close their doors on data. Again, that's been a thing for as long as we can remember. The Great Firewall has existed for more than 10, 15 years at this point. But I will just say that as China starts to deploy some of their maybe perhaps pain-inducing policies, I think in the United States, folks like myself and others who are more on the China watcher side should be paying attention to how these policies might have unintended consequences for China. I think the more China closes its doors on its own data, the more it's actually going to hurt itself. I think one great example involves some of the protections around genetic data, for instance, where actually there's been cases where biology researchers in China are not actually able to share the underlying data of their research projects, but are still publishing those in international journals. And that's caused a lot of uproar for folks, in the United States and other places that say, hey, it's not fair. You can't publish your stuff if you're not held to the same standard as we are. So in terms of improving its own capacity in certain technological fields, particularly biology, which is so important, I don't necessarily know that China is fully aware of the unintended consequences, but I think they are closely watching them.
All right, well, we are about out of time. There's so much more we could have discussed, but our time has come to an end. So thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your insights. And I'll turn it over to Peter for closing remarks.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you, of course, to all of our panelists for such a great discussion this morning. As you heard from Matt at the start of this event, this report is the culmination of over a year's worth of work and research, and I think that showed actually in the conversation this morning among our panelists, including, of course, with Emily and the others. And that work and research was complete with over 4 successfully executed workshops during the course of the year and 3 strategic insights memos that Emily and I published on this topic, as well as, of course, the report that we put out today. So the strategy that we present here today offers a roadmap for the U.S. to avoid the alternative world that I detailed in my earlier remarks, and also to avoid many of the pitfalls that you heard from the panelists today. Getting to this place, of course, will not be easy, but by following the 3 elements that we talked about at some length on the panel, and that we talk about in some length in the report, promote, protect, coordinate, the U.S. can be an effective coordinator with China and can of course, stay ahead in the tech race, as we call it. So on behalf of the Scowcroft Center, the Global China Hub, my co-author Emily, and myself, thank you all for joining us this morning.
欢迎收看本视频报道。今日我们将重点关注《外国情报监视法》中的重要部分 FISA 第702条款。在本报道中，我将解释 FISA 第702条款的含义、运作方式、围绕其展开的争议，以及关于是否重新授权的持续辩论。那 FISA 到底是什么？美国副检察长解释
Section 702 is the law that enables the United States government to obtain intelligence by targeting non-Americans who are overseas and who are using U.S.-based communication services.
从其核心来看 ，FISA 702是外国情报监视法中的一个规定，允许美国政府在不需要令状的情况下，对位于国外的外国公民进行情报收集。FISA 最早于1978年签署成为法律。第702条款是 FISA 第7号修正案的一部分，于2008年签署成为法律。修正案7中包括了一个日落条款，规定了修正案在何时到期，如果未获得重新授权的话。修正案7已经2次获得了重新授权，分别是在2012年和2018年。如果不再次获得重新授权，它将于今年12月31日到期。 重要的是，在 FSA 第7号修正案中，还包括第703和704条款，允许对位于国外的美国公民的通信进行收集。在爱德华·斯诺登揭露了机密文件，揭示了 FSA 如何在没有令状的情况下大规模收集美国人的数据之后，以及随后的2017年联邦调查局 FBI 的飓风交叉火力调查，该调查使用 FSA 令状收集了对卡特·佩奇的证据。FBI 怀疑他是俄罗斯的外国特工。为了增加关于 FSA 如何用于收集通信的透明度，以及关于如何在 FSA 第702条款下收集美国人通信的透明度，人们付出了持续的努力。
All right, so the good news is that at its very core, FISA's privacy and oversight framework is designed to do exactly that, to sustain public confidence through rigorous and regular scrutiny by all three branches of government.
这种透明度主要围绕着 FSA 的使用程序、系统中的制衡机制，以防止滥用，同时也在一定程度上揭示了系统的运作方式。在情报机构能够根据702条款收集通信之前，美国司法部长和国家情报总监必须向外国情报监视法庭提交认证。这个特殊的法庭是专门为了审查监视机构是否违反 FISA 法律而设立的。这些认证描述了每个情报机构计划如何收集通信，以及正在被收集的情报类别。国家情报总监的报告解释道，这些类别必须符合外国情报信息的法定定义。认证内容包括有关国际恐怖主义和其他主题的信息，例如获取有关大规模杀伤性武器信息。认证必须每年提交一次，外国情报监视法庭可以一并批准所有认证。问题关键在于，一旦外国情报监视法庭批准了国家情报总监和司法部长的认证，情报机构就可以自由地大规模收集通信，并将其存入数据库，而无需受到外国情报监视法庭的监督。为了将通信收集到数据库中，分析师会确定一个目标的选择器、电话号码、电子邮件地址或 IP 地址，并迫使美国的私营公司与情报机构共享与这些标识符相关的所有通信。这充分利用了世界上大部分互联网基础设施经过美国或由美国公司维护的情况。
How do we look at the private sector differently? How do we actually leverage this idea of, hey, the private sector has an incredible amount of power?
有2个收集计划，上游 Upstream 专门由美国国家安全局 NSA 负责，他们可以强迫维护互联网基础设施的美国公司，如服务器农场、互联网电缆、埃隆·马斯克的星链卫星，共享通过其基础设施传递的目标通信。下游 Downstream 不仅适用于 NSA 数据库，还适用于中央情报局 CIA 数据库、联邦调查局 FBI 数据库以及国家反恐怖主义中心 NCTC 数据库，使这些机构能够从维护目标账户的私营公司中收集通信。为了充分了解监视的规模，以下是一些为账户提供服务并被迫通过下游计划与政府分享数据的美国公司的列表。苹果因此所有在 iPhone、Mac 电脑、Apple Watch 等设备上通过信息应用发送的消息。谷歌因此包括 Gmail 和所有 Google Drive 服务。Facebook 因此包括 WhatsApp、Instagram、Messenger。亚马逊其拥有亚马逊网络服务 Amazon Web Services， 为许多国际公司提供云计算服务。微软因此包括 Outlook、Skype 和所有云计算服务。
So let me pause here and offer a couple of hypothetical scenarios in which 702 could prove crucial, to put some specifics on the table. Suppose the FBI gets information that an individual someone overseas appears to be recruiting employees of a U.S. semiconductor company, possibly for the purpose of gaining access to sensitive U.S. technology for military purposes. An analyst at the FBI, with that information, could target that overseas individual's email under 702, and this would help us figure out what technology they may be seeking to take, whether it might be used to advance that country's military. That's one example. A second is, suppose a foreign partner tells us that an overseas individual is attempting to sell weapons to a rogue nation that's under U.S. sanctions. We get that information from a foreign intelligence partner. Under 702, we could move quickly to acquire that overseas individual's communications, to gather more intelligence about his or her activities, who that person is dealing with, even if there was not probable cause to believe that that person was acting as an agent of a foreign power. A third hypothetical. Suppose a foreign partner captures a terrorist on the battlefield, not an uncommon scenario. That person who's captured on the battlefield has a phone, and our foreign partner gets a list of email contacts from that terrorist's phone. With that information, with that list of email addresses, intelligence analysts here, our intelligence analysts, could use 702 to gain insights about other people that terrorist is in contact with, understand that network, and that would help us disrupt ongoing or future plots.
情报机构无法通过关键词或姓名在其通信数据库中进行搜索，而必须通过标识符，例如电子邮件地址或电话号码进行搜索。在为实现透明度的努力中，国家情报总监在2023年的年度报告中透露，美国公民的标识符在2022年被用作查询超过8400次。这意味着情报机构在2022年在其数据库中共进行了8400次搜索，以查找美国公民的电话号码、电子邮件地址等。之所以收集了这些美国公民的通信，是因为他们与超过24万个被收集通信的目标之间有过通信。目标是指那些其电子邮件地址或电话号码被用来进行通信收集的个人。查询是指对已收集通信数据库进行的个别搜索。让我们审视一些案例研究，并讨论围绕 FISA 第702条款的一些争议。在对卡特·佩奇进行的2017年联邦调查局 FBI 调查中， FBI 在向外国情报监视法庭 FISC 申请 FISA 令状时存在17次错误或遗漏，这导致特朗普的盟友和支持者指责执法机构对保守派持有偏见。此外，还发现 FBI 在数年的时间里共计在数据库中滥用搜索功能278000次，包括对2020年黑人生命要紧 Black Lives Matter 抗议者的调查中。美国公民自由联盟批评702条款，称尽管第702条款被合理地作为一项反恐工具进行辩解，但实际上它允许了远远超出保护国家安全所需范围的监视。它使政府有权针对国外的外国人，只要其认为他们拥有外国情报信息，而这个定义如此宽泛，以至于它可以包括与国家安全无关的有关外交事务的普通信息。这意味着被监视的目标可能包括人权捍卫者、记者、告密者或企业主。政府会收集这些个人的个人信息，包括他们与美国境内人士的任何通信，然后将其存储在数据库中多年，甚至在某些情况下是永久存储。鉴于我国滥用监视权力的历史，以及该计划周围的保密性，我们应该担心第702条款正被用于过度地针对不受欢迎的群体，无论是少数族群社区、政治活动人士，甚至是记者。702条款的问题之一在于，虽然现在在 FISC 审批702搜索的官僚过程方面更加透明，但情报机构确定谁有资格成为目标的方式尚不清楚。在政府看来，黑人生命要紧抗议者是否对国家安全构成威胁？英国或德国的气候活动家呢？此外，考虑到中美之间的紧张局势，特别是关于中国警察在中国境外的报道，这也令人担忧。美国政府是否将海外的中国移民视为可能与这些警察局有关联的外国特工？这些问题暗示了702条款所带来的模糊性和潜在滥用问题，以及它如何影响不同群体，包括政治活动人士、少数族群以及国际关系中的各种动态。美国副检察长和网络司令部负责人纳卡索尼将军都描述了702条款如何阻止了来自中国的多起威胁。
Today we are relentlessly focused on serious threats, such as the Chinese government's efforts to spy on us and to steal our sensitive technologies, Iran's sanctions evasions, North Korea's nuclear program, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Let me stress the threat we face from China in particular. At this moment, when China is ramping up its efforts to spy on Americans, we must not blind ourselves to that threat by allowing 702 to expire.
There is a scope, scale, sophistication that we ascribe to what China is doing today. Are they getting better? Yes. But I think the question always comes back to us as we think about this, how do we address it? And what are our competitive advantages against a nation that has so much scope, so much scale, and increasing sophistication? Well, I think it begins with this idea of our competitive advantages are, first of all, being able to understand what our adversary is doing. You mentioned intelligence gathering. You mentioned this idea of, utilizing different capabilities to spy on us. Certainly we have to address this. I am very concerned, and we are addressing the issues that we made public in May of this past spring about China living off the land, this idea of positioning themselves in different critical infrastructure elements of the United States, our allies, our territories, to perhaps utilize in the future. Why are they doing that? Why are they in our critical infrastructure?
随着第7号修正案到期日期的临近，一场激烈的辩论正在展开。支持者包括内卡索尼将军和美国助理检察长马修·奥尔森等人，强调 FISA 第702条款在国家安全方面的重要性。批评者如美国公民自由联盟 VoxEU 呼吁进行改革，指出对无需令状的监视和滥用收集数据的担忧。总之 FISA 第702条款是一个复杂的框架，将国家安全、隐私和问责制紧密交织在一起。随着第7号修正案面临重新授权，关于其效力和伦理影响的讨论仍然在法律和公民权利讨论的前沿。感谢收看本次关于 FISA 第702条款的全面报道。如果您喜欢，可以点赞、分享并订阅，以获取更多有益的内容。
China's supercomputing industry adeptly adapted to U.S. embargoes in 2015 by pivoting to domestically produced components, but its 5G industry failed to do so when faced with similar U.S. sanctions in May 2019. This column argues that while China's supercomputing industrial policies were well designed, with the central government accentuating the acceleration of upgrading the entire industrial chain, its 5G industrial policies, particularly from 2015 to May 2019, misdirected companies and investors, hampered optimal resource distribution, and skewed industrial progression. Immense national economic resources and state intervention may not necessarily translate into industrial advancement and technological superiority. Industrial policies, once scoffed at by mainstream economists, have surged in prominence over the last 15 years, a trend magnified following the 2008 global financial crisis, Roderick 2010, Vogel 2021. Within the recent 5-year context marked by the ongoing U.S.-China trade war and great power high-tech rivalry, Zheng 2018, Zhang and Cheng 2021, Eichengreen 2023, an increasing number of countries have augmented their reliance on industrial policies in a bid to bolster international competitiveness. Significantly, the Chinese central government has ardently promoted two strategic high-tech industries, 5G and supercomputing, with robust industrial policies. Intriguingly, while the supercomputing industry adeptly adapted to U.S. embargoes in 2015 by pivoting to domestically produced components as alternatives to U.S. imports, China's 5G industry failed to do so when faced with similar U.S. sanctions in May 2019. Why could the 5G industry not produce key upstream components, whereas the supercomputing industry could? Centralized governance in China exerts an influential grip over its economic, business, and social activities, Lardy 2019, Lee and O'Brien 2021. Previous scholarship has shown the causal effects of industrial policies on China's domestic industrial development, Lin 2017, Wang et al. 2022. Building upon the existing literature, in my recent paper, Zheng 2023, I address this puzzle with a focus on China's central government-level 5G and supercomputing industrial policies. I also endeavor to provide insights into the driving factors steering these policies. It is imperative to clarify that I do not solely attribute the divergent outcomes to industrial policies, however, devoid of a critical examination of the 5G and supercomputing industrial policies, one remains bereft of a comprehensive understanding of the disparate development trajectories of the aforementioned industries. Further, an in-depth analysis of the Chinese 5G and supercomputing industrial policies can contribute to academic and policy debates on the efficacy of industrial policies, especially how they should be practiced. Roderick 2010, Calypsody et al. 2019. Prior to presenting the discoveries, it is worth noting that both the 5G and supercomputing industries encompass upstream, midstream, and downstream segments. In the Chinese context, upstream refers to the research and development, R&D, and the production of core components such as 5G and supercomputing chips and software. Midstream signifies infrastructure construction like 5G networks, base stations, and supercomputing centers. Downstream points to applications and related services. Notably, the upstream segment is crucial for enabling 5G infrastructure construction and the operation of supercomputers. Title 1, Divergent 5G and Supercomputing Industrial Policies. Using natural language processing, a machine learning technique, and qualitative content analysis based on meticulously collected official documents and secondary sources, I identify salient policy differences. The principal findings are as follows. First, China commenced the promulgation of 5G industrial policies in 2015. Before May 2019, these policies were significantly unbalanced. Within the corpus of 12 official documents from 2015 to May 2019 concerning 5G, words epitomizing midstream and downstream activities, such as commercial application, network, and industrialization, overshadowed their upstream counterparts, indicating that the central government put much less weight on the upstream than the midstream and downstream. While these documents sporadically mention phrases associated with 5G chips and components, signaling a modicum of attention to the upstream segment, a careful review reveals that merely 4 documents, 33.3%, mention developing the upstream, whereas 7, 58.3%, and a staggering 12, 100%, champion midstream and downstream advancements, respectively. Alarmingly, the scant references to 5G chip development were bereft of specificity, leaving a void in strategic prioritization. Consequently, Chinese upstream companies lacked incentives and sufficient resources, thereby either focusing on labor-intensive production or relying on purchasing foreign core components. Second, in stark contrast, supercomputing industrial policies were well designed, with the central government accentuating the acceleration of upgrading the entire industrial chain. The most commonly used words in the policy documents were intellectual property rights, research, technology, independence, infrastructure, and industrialization. These documents also highlighted the development of essential parts, software innovation, and integrated circuits. The 863 program, a national-level industrial policy spanning from 1986 to 2016, played an indispensable role in achieving technological independence in the supercomputing industry. This program birthed an expert responsibility system, ensuring the supercomputing industrial policy advice and design by the experts resonated with the overarching vision of the central government. It also made government-funded public entities instead of private companies the dominant player in the research, development, and deployment of supercomputers. Such an arrangement prevented the problem we have witnessed in the case of 5G development. Public entities' objective was not to reap short-term economic profits, rather, they served Chinese national interests and focused on long-term technological advancement. Third, from 2021 onward, a marked inflection was discernible in the 5G industrial policies, specifying the types of 5G chips China aspired to indigenously produce. Certain policy documents have explicitly demanded comprehensive R&D encompassing not just the chips but also other upstream components. This policy shift had immediate effects, driving more Chinese companies to flock to the upstream and develop their own components with venture capital funding. However, an analytical overview intimates that the overall policy attention devoted to the upstream segment remains much lower, 28.6%, in contrast to the midstream, 64.3%, and downstream, 92.9%. Title 2, Motivations for the Policy Divergence. Drawing from political economics frameworks, I point out that domestically, the allure of swift GDP augmentation stemming from 5G infrastructure investments and downstream applications juxtaposed against the resource-intensive and high-risk nature of upstream research largely influenced policy choices. Internationally, a propitious environment made it easy for China to import key 5G upstream components. Consequently, China's 5G policies between 2015 and May 2019 exhibited an inadvertent sidelining of upstream endeavors. Although policies have started to rebalance since 2021, significant challenges in internal economic transitions, Zheng 2011, Pettis 2021, coupled with exogenous supply shocks, Freeman and Baldwin 2022, rendered infrastructure investment in commercial applications the sole viable conduits for economic growth. In contrast, a confluence of international antagonism, domestic impetus, and Deng Xiaoping's imprimatur shaped the Chinese supercomputing policy landscape and trajectory in its own unique way. On the international front, the lingering animosities of the Cold War era in the 1980s galvanized an unwavering commitment among the Chinese top leaders and strategic scientists to indigenously develop high technologies including supercomputers. At the heart of this domestic confluence was Deng Xiaoping, China's paramount leader of the era, who decisively spearheaded the 863 program that spanned 3 decades and cast a long shadow over China's supercomputing-related industrial policies. Title 3, Lessons Learned. Many scholars accept the claim that industrial policy can successfully promote the development of targeted industries. My analysis, however, shows that China's 5G industrial policies, particularly from 2015 to May 2019, misdirected companies and investors, hampered optimal resource distribution, and skewed industrial progression. This observation further implies that immense national economic resources and state intervention may not necessarily translate into industrial advancement and technological superiority. A salient takeaway centers on the imperative of formulating astute industrial policies. For strategic high-tech industries critical for economic growth and national security, industrial policies should not overlook the development of any segment of the industrial chain. Core components and technologies need to be self-built. Furthermore, the nature of these strategic sectors mandates profound governmental stewardship rather than a sheer dependence on market dynamics. The strategic amalgamation of national resources, leveraging national labs and publicly funded academic institutions for pioneering R&D endeavors, instituting stringent oversight and accountability frameworks, and fostering symbiotic alliances with technically adept enterprises can collectively engender well-balanced industrial evolution. This point finds strong resonance in the trajectory of China's supercomputing industry. Lastly, as countries increasingly recalibrate their industrial policies, the foundational tenets of the liberal international economic order, Roland 2021, are under threat. Industrial policies such as local content requirements and high-tech export restrictions thwart foreign countries' access to domestic markets, impede the unfettered dissemination of knowledge and technology, and engender geo-economic rivalry.
Hello， 大家好，欢迎关注华尔街电视频道。这一期的热点深度关注习近平在刚刚结束的南非金砖峰会上的一场一幕，他真的是没有翻译就寸步难行了吗？习近平走红毯的那一刻到底发生了什么？时间回到南非约翰内斯堡时间2023年的8月23日，金砖峰会的第2天，各国领导人士依次入场。那在印度总理莫迪之后，中国国家主席习近平入场，视频显示习近平身后的一名随行人员也试图进入会场内部。此时出现一名现场的安保人员，将习近平的这位随行人员拦住并将其从大门前推开，最后这个大门就关闭了。那视频显示的是习近平发现自己落单之后改变了走路的步伐，继续朝前走时一边的侧脸还似乎想确认后方的情况。那在小走这个数步之后，他是直接停下，愣在原地，数秒之后又回头望向紧闭的大门，之后才又继续往前走。这一段视频随后立刻是在社交平台上热传，不少人就认出被挡下的随行人员不是习近平的保镖，而是跟随习近平10多年的英文翻译孙宁。那会不会是习近平发现自己的翻译没有跟上担心等会儿自己和人交流会有障碍，所以显得当即就有一点不知所措呢？其实这里还紧接着有第2个问题，那就是习近平会不会英语？那关于第2个问题其实川普之前曾经回答过，我们也放上一段关于川普谈到习近平的视频。
I told him we shot 57 missiles into Syria while he was having chocolate cake. It's the only time he said, repeat. That was the only word I've ever heard him say in English, meaning he speaks English, okay?
上面这个视频片段是2023年4月上旬，美国前总统川普接受前福克斯新闻主播塔克·卡尔森的专访，其中川普回忆了2017年时，当时习近平访问美国，两人在晚宴之后正吃着巧克力甜点时，川普突然告诉习近平，美国刚刚向叙利亚发射了50多枚飞弹，且全部命中。 习近平回了一句英语 repeat 意思是让川普重复一遍。那川普认为习近平很明显是会英语的，但是习近平的英语会到什么程度，那还需要花更多的时间进行一番考证。接着我们来谈一谈习近平随从里的这个翻译团队。有视频显示在习近平走在红毯上进入会场时这个翻译人员孙宁是从另一个方向出现，而不是跟随着习近平的一个状态。很明显，这是一个颇为意外的画面。作为习近平的翻译，那需要紧跟习近平到什么程度？这里有一段视频可以体现。上面这个视频片段是2022年的这个11月，在泰国曼谷举办的亚太经济合作会议，这个 APEC 领袖峰会。画面显示的是智利总统博里奇同习近平在会议前互动。在视频开头是博里奇刚刚结束同加拿大总理特鲁多的寒暄，紧接着博里奇又找到习近平进行交谈。在过程之中习近平是突然往后方一指，随后有一位随行人员是小跑步到二人身旁，这应该是习近平要求翻译协助，随后两人在翻译的帮助下相谈甚欢。作为翻译，那需要跟习近平跟得多紧，这个片段可以展示的非常明白。值得一提的是，这场亚太经济合作会议前还有一场 G20 峰会。在 G20 闭幕式上，当时习近平与特鲁多在20国集团峰会期间相见，一位加拿大摄影记者拍到的有声现场画面就显示，习近平看起来正就两人此前的一个非正式会谈正向特鲁多表达不满。当时习近平说，我们交谈的一切都泄露给了报纸去了，不合适，而且我们也不是这样进行的，如果有诚心，咱们就应该相互尊重的态度进行很好的沟通，否则这个结果就不好说了。而特鲁多则回应说他希望双方继续进行建设性的合作，在加拿大我们信奉自由、公开及坦率的对话。习近平没等自己的翻译说完，便说创造条件，创造条件。说罢，他与特鲁多握了握手，便立即终止了谈话，转身离开。而这名习近平的翻译就是孙宁。从这个照片上你可以看到孙宁是位于画面的右边。整理曾经的公开报道可以知道孙宁的这个过往。孙宁是1981年出生在江苏南京，妻子张磊同为中共外交部的这个翻译。孙宁是在1993年考取了南京外国语学校，在南京外国语学校度过了6年的初高中生活。他还就读于北京外国语大学的英语系，曾公派赴英留学。孙宁在大学毕业之后进入这个中国外交部翻译室工作。杨洁篪担任中共外长期间孙宁曾是杨洁篪的翻译。在2013年3月17日，当时的中国前总理李克强就任中国总理之后的首场记者会上，孙宁作为现场翻译，因此广为人知。当时5天之后，习近平以这个中国国家主席的身份首次出访俄罗斯时，孙宁又成为了习近平的翻译。此后在习近平的外事活动中你是经常能看到孙宁的身影，成为习近平身边这个最贴近的一员。此前有一篇关于孙宁的采访，其中就谈到翻译。孙宁说当年是没想过自己要去当翻译，因为在大学期间参加过21世纪杯的这个英语口语的演讲比赛，并拿到了冠军，这引起了中国外交部的关注，所以有了进入外交部翻译室的机会。起初孙宁还曾有过一番思想斗争，但后来的选择让他至今都不曾后悔。而作为高级翻译，孙宁说自己需要时刻陪同在领导的身边，随时待命。有时活动安排的特别紧，甚至整天不敢喝一口水，吃一口饭，因为必须随时做好翻译的准备。如果吃东西的时候领导讲话了，那需要翻译，那这个食物吞也不是，咽也不是，水呢也不得不很少喝，怕上厕所耽误工作。孙宁还戏称他比同事有优势，因为孙宁是左撇子，可以右手记录，左手吃饭。那在外人看来光鲜亮丽的外交翻译，这个在孙宁的眼里就像水面上的天鹅。孙宁说人们看到的是水面上天鹅很优雅的一面，但实际上在水下，天鹅的2只爪子一直在辛苦的游泳，它有它的纠结，它有它背后付出的努力，只不过那些不为人知所罢了。好了，以上就是今天热点深度的所有内容。更多资讯可以关注6度简报网站，网址是6度brief.com， 在上面你可以订阅 各类符合您喜好的简报新闻有免费的套餐，也有更加专业的付费套餐供大家选择。今天的视频就到这里，我们下个节目再见。
I'd love to know how you got interested in China, and then second, how did you build a career as an analyst of China's political economy?
Sure. So, I mean, as with quite a lot of the sort of older China hands, I don't come from a academically economic or financial background. I was actually an English literature with a medieval focus. So that was my entry point into the industry. But then there not being a ton of jobs in medieval English literature, I went to work for JP Morgan coming out of college and did some pretty interesting stuff in a structuring and solutions team that I suppose I was hired into on the basis that my math ability at the time was basically GCSE level. So like 15-year-old level, I hadn't done any at A level. And so all of the kind of financial industry interviews were essentially testing mental math at that level. And so that was very familiar to me. It was really up in my mind. So yeah, I did that for a few years. Very interesting, but global financial crisis intervened. And so it became not a very pleasant place to be. And so then I came out to Beijing in 2010 to do my MBA at Tsinghua University, in their international MBA program. And then read some stuff by Arthur Kroeber and co at Dragonomics and thought it was excellent and got in touch with them. Started off interning, doing all kinds of odd jobs, and so then progressed into writing research. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
We're here to discuss this really great client report that you put out, which was actually flagged to me, as I told Arthur when I reached out to get his blessing to bother you to see if you could come on the podcast. I had done so because I had about 4 or 5 clients of Gavco Dragonomics reach out and say, you should have Thomas on to talk about this because the report was so good, which I agree. And so we're going to dive into this today because it's a really exemplary and exhaustive look at the state of Chinese corporates, their ability to raise capital, what the state of their profits are, how they're being affected by industrial policy. But because we're recording this on August 21st at a moment where there's acute anxiety and a surge of commentary on the state of China's economy after just day after day of negative news coming out, I wanted to take advantage of your time here to ask for your assessment. I was going to call this a hot take, but this is what you do for a living, so this wouldn't qualify as a hot take. But I think the big questions on everyone's mind is this the beginning of the end? China has been able to pull rabbits out of hats for decades. There's a debate about, is this the convergence of deep structural forces, or is this a cyclical forces that with a little bit of time and some policy, the right policy interventions, China's going to be able to navigate its way out of this? Is it a combination of those? So if I could just get your sense of how bad is this? How much agency does Beijing have to steer through or around this? And do you see, has the big China story just shifted inexorably, which seems to be some of the vibe I'm getting as people are processing news of the past few weeks and months?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because I think our house take in general is that we're not on the brink of an imminent financial crisis in a sort of layman model for basically reasons that are attached to the fact that the Chinese financial system is just a very different beast to the US, certainly to the US back at that period. Specifically, all of the vast majority of the banking system is controlled explicitly by the state, both through shareholdings, but also through a lot more in terms of window guidance and informal channels, and that there's been quite a lot of work done to disconnect and disentangle the shadow sections of the financial system from the big banks. And I think that in general that's been done reasonably well. And so the picture at the moment when you see news coming out like the collapse of Zhongrong Trust, these kind of shadow pseudo bank institutions which are exposed to the property sector, the bag holders at the end of the day for those are going to be basically households, wealthy households who've invested in trust products and WMPs. It's not the same as it would have been back, let's say 5 or 6 years ago, where there was all of this entanglement with the formal banking system too. So you've got that going on in terms of the linkages. The second part being that basically the banks can and have been delaying recognition of losses on their balance sheet for a long while, and there is basically no catalyst that will force them to do so if the state doesn't force them to do so. So you've got basically deposits trapped, all your liabilities are these sticky household liabilities that can't really go anywhere else, and actually where they've been getting more and more and more of them because since people haven't been buying housing. And then on the other side, on the asset side, yeah, there's probably a considerable amount of non-performing loans, particularly at the moment and in the property sector, but they just don't have to recognize them fast enough for that to kind of spiral out of control in a weeks or months or probably even quarters or years timescale. So that's the good news. The bad news is that I think that you can have a systemic problem or even a systemic crisis without it being a financial crisis. So the systemic problem set that we're basically facing in China right now is that the property sector is in really dire straits, and it's very difficult to over-egg the pudding on that. You've got property sales at less than half of 2019 levels, property starts at about 40% of 2019 levels. Liquidity situation for developers is absolutely terrible, as you can see from Country Garden defaulting even now on onshore debt. So they're cutting all of anywhere that they can stop the cash bleed, they're doing it, and at some point that's also going to translate into stalled ongoing projects and completions falling off too. And that was exactly the kind of negative feedback loop that started this property crisis back in Q3 of last year to begin with. The households saw Evergrande in particular not stalling on projects, not delivering houses that they paid in advance for, and then panicking, and they just stopped buying new houses, not only from Evergrande, but from other developers they're worried about as well. So as and when we get into that kind of death loop again, starting at a much lower level of sales than was even the case during that crisis, then what developer liquidity does exist just dries up even further. So there's a self-fulfilling doom loop there. So that's the property situation. And the problem is that the central government policy reaction function is so slow and insufficient at the moment because they are and have been increasingly operating in this ideological straitjacket. So back in the good days, you talked about the power of this like black cat, white cat pragmatism. And that's really been overtaken increasingly by a sort of resurgent moralistic Marxist view of the economy where you have good and bad economic actors. And that yoked to this somewhat self-deluding notion that the good government-driven tech investment can and will, in the short term, replace bad property speculation as the primary driver of growth. And so if you look at the world in those terms, then you can justify a sort of, I don't know, like Victorian or Austrian or even maybe traditional Chinese medicine analogous belief that actually economic pain and suffering are a good thing as long as they're happening to the bad guys, and that the good guys won't worry. And you actually see this explicitly coming out of the government, so that they won't worry about housing prices falling, for instance, if you're a household who's just bought your house to live in, and that none of that will affect their income or their willingness to consume, even as their like sole retirement savings vehicle sheds value. So there's all of this kind of going on that is just creating a really bad situation that is feeding back into itself, that is very much stemming from the property sector. You know, this is not, you know, the entirety of the Chinese economy being kind of intrinsically fragile or a house of cards or weak. It's a property phenomenon, but it's a property phenomenon that is affecting everything really fast, on which the central government just doesn't really seem to have a grasp on. And I think the extremely disappointing translation of the rate cut on Monday is the most recent example of that.
I would love the irony if China, in this increasingly sort of Marxist moralistic view of markets, it was Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek who was sitting on Xi Jinping's bedside night table, and so it was Austrian economics driving it. I doubt it is, but it would be an interesting irony. And just very quickly, Thomas, for the lay listener, can you just paint a very quick picture of why trouble in the real estate sector is of such singular importance to China? I mean, no country wants to see problems in your real estate sector. Of course, we saw in our own financing of real estate in 2007-8, we had some problems. But just very quickly, why is real estate so uniquely important for China, or for the economy at least?
Sure. From the household perspective, it's important because it's basically their sole savings vehicle for retirement for most people. There are some people who have decent state pensions And the provision of state healthcare has improved, certainly. But for most people, their savings are tied up very much in the house, or more than one house in many cases. Home ownership is much higher in China than it is in any other economy at a comparable stage of development, or indeed to most developed economies. And so for households, housing is more important in China than basically anywhere else. It's also more important because China produces all of the things necessary to make these houses. So you think about US or Europe, some portion of the materials going into housing have to be local, cement specifically, but you can buy steel from other places. And most of the electronic machinery and equipment going into housing is going to be from China. So, all of your little fuse boxes and wiring and things like that. China's producing all that itself. So when property construction slows down or speeds up, as it did from about 2 million units at the start of the 2000s to maybe 11 or 12 million towards the peak, that's fantastic for the rest of the materials producing sectors. So you get a boost to construction, tens of millions of people working in the construction sector, another millions, if not tens of millions, working in material producing sectors, steel, glass, cement, copper, all of these kinds of things. So the whole vast swathes of the heavy industrial economy were built basically to serve housing, and when housing had its little downturns, to serve infrastructure projects. And so if you get some situation like this where, and there is a lag to it, so if we've got sales down 50%, starts down worse than that, real estate investment is down only about 10% from 2019. So you've got your inputs and your outputs to the construction kind of pipeline. But that pipeline, if the inputs are shrinking as much as they are, will shrink itself over time quite considerably. So far, steel production has been okay this year. We've started to see glass and cement come down a little bit. But the really bad story for those sectors will happen in the future if we continue to get conditions running as they are running. And so that's the specter that is haunting the Chinese economy at the moment, the idea that this 30% plus of economic activity will be directly affected by the housing slowdown. And then everything else gets affected because people are employed, they have wages, the wage growth slows, they get unemployed, and you get this knock-on effect that is very large.
I mean, there's a nice tie-in because obviously the real estate sector is at the heart of the downturn now, and at the heart of your report, which this is just a teaser, but at the end, I think we'll talk about the big implication of what dwindling capital, what sort of dwindling resources going into the real estate sector means. And in some ways, it sounds like a good thing. And that's been, for a long time, there's been criticisms that China's, economic growth was over-reliant on the real estate sector. That's true. But as always, the challenge is, if not real estate, then what? But we'll get into that a bit later. So turning now to the report, you combed through 6,032 offshore listed non-financial firm annual reports.
Onshore and offshore.
Onshore and offshore. And we're trying to look at basically what the picture is for corporates since COVID. There's a lot of insight and conclusions you've come to, but I wanted to just at a very high level, and then we'll go into each of these in more detail, but ask you if you could just give your sort of thumbnail sketch of what did you find? What were the big sort of takeaways from this research?
Sure. Yeah. So the reason that we kind of wanted to look at it in these terms is basically that the way that capital flows in the economy is, it's not always evident from the surface, but it is something that the leaders in Beijing are really thinking about a lot on a kind of day-to-day, month-to-month basis, because they're thinking in terms of industrial policy and in terms of where should the available resource of the economy be flowing in order to generate the sort of economy and the sort of society that they want to create, both in terms of improving people's lifestyles and increasing their resilience, particularly to kind of external shocks. And so the reason that it's interesting to think in those terms is that it kind of starts to connect these disparate strands of the various kind of crises which hit China's corporate sector over the course of the pandemic. And so you have kind of four main ones, basically. You have this profit shock, which hit consumer-focused sectors very hard as a consequence of repeated COVID restrictions and lockdowns. And then within that, a kind of intentional regulatory shock to the internet platforms as a consequence of the crackdowns that really savaged Tencent, Alibaba, and co's earnings and profits. You got a leverage shock, which was the crackdown on financing to real estate developers, the so-called three red lines. which then translated into an unintentional confidence spiral among home buyers, which has just completely crushed sector profits for real estate developers and at the same time crushed their access to capital. You have a broader capital raising shock that is a consequence of a number of factors, the tech crackdown, COVID policy, US and Chinese regulatory actions, and then geopolitical risks and temperature heating up that have made it far, far more difficult for Chinese firms to raise funds from foreign investors in Hong Kong and in the US. And then finally, you have this industrial policy shock, which was there has long been a intentional channeling of resources towards certain sectors, new energy, electric vehicles, and most notably semiconductors. That industrial policy push has been strongly intensified by US sanctions as kind of China doubles down on industrial policies that are supposed to accelerate the domestic production of technology hardware that they are worried about losing access to in the near term, and some of which they already have lost access to. So those four shocks together have kind of combined to create a very significant shift in the marginal annual flows of capital to different sectors of the economy.
I don't know how to ask this question in a way that will maybe be coherent enough, but I wanted to understand the role of COVID in these four shocks. Maybe ask it a counterfactual, which is, imagine a world in which COVID didn't emerge from Wuhan. How much of the shock of these four shocks do you think would be with us today?
I think it would be very significantly less.
Okay.
I think most importantly, I think without COVID, you don't get the same wholesale destruction of the service sector and consumer-focused industries, which have had such a negative impact on people's employment and income expectations and livelihood. And that kind of multi-year trauma that households went through has been, I think, quite a strong input into their falling risk appetite, both for housing and for other kinds of assets. So COVID is really important on that front. I think also COVID really helped to dial up tensions with the US.
Yeah.
And in general, kind of China's, the feelings about China and the rest of the world in a way which feeds back into this toxic negative feedback loop. So yeah, I think COVID was really important. And, maybe not so much COVID, but the way that China handled it relative to other countries. And, I think very few places handled it super well. But yeah, I think it was really important.
So if we can just go maybe through the four shocks in more detail, I think we might spend a little bit longer time on the capital raising and industrial policy shocks. But just starting with the profit shocks, or the profit shock,
mm-hmm.
I wonder if you can talk about the winners and losers in terms of retained earnings. Not all sectors of the economy did as poorly as others, obviously. And again, listeners can't see the chart I'm looking on page 3,
mm-hmm.
which shows just a significant fall off in real estate, which matches the story we were just talking about earlier. But I wonder if you can unpack a little bit who was hit most and who has done relatively well in terms of retained earnings.
Sure. So yeah, real estate's done absolutely terribly. Energy and materials firms did very well in 2021 and 2022 in an inflationary environment. Consumer goods and services firms did pretty bad. You saw a very significant fall in the year-on-year change in retained earnings. And then the other kind of big winners were capital goods and tech hardware firms who were really kind of riding on the back of a big run-up in prices of electronic components globally as you got this big surge of purchases of computers and phones and things like that in the pandemic era. That translates into a worse situation environment for private firms than for SOEs.
Right.
So you have a lot of private participation in the real estate sector. They got absolutely hammered, Evergrande being private. And perceptions of the riskiness of developers really kind of widen the gap then between what kind of developers home buyers were willing to buy from. So yeah, that has had very significant impacts. But more broadly, so, consumer goods and services tend to be private driven.
Okay. The distinction I was going to ask is that a nature of it private versus state-owned enterprise, or is it because SOEs tend to be in certain, you mentioned energy and materials, a lot of those are dominated by SOEs, so they're more upstream versus more consumer-facing private sector companies?
Yeah, a lot of it's sectoral, and then you have within the within the real estate sector, there is a discrimination based on perceptions of implicit guarantee as well.
Right. Shock 2, deleveraging. One of the interesting things was talking about the accumulation of non-debt liabilities. I mean, this is one of the sort of peculiar things of China's real estate market, which is pre-sales, which is not something we traditionally do here. So you buy the home before it is shovels even in the ground. But I wonder if you could talk a bit about how this non-debt liability picture has changed. And then I think a second question is, how do you unwind that growth in non-debt liabilities, or can you?
Yeah, it's extremely difficult. So you have kind of two non-debt liability problems basically in the Chinese economy. One of them is real estate specific, and that tends to be focused in the private sector firms. So private sector developers, there was a boom in debt issuance, bond issuance, that I think was kind of 2016, 2017, 2018, where private firms were able to issue bonds and where their financing situation was decently good. And so you got this run up of both bank loans and bond issuance that led to rising debt to equity ratio. Then all of that basically fell off really hard from, I think it's mid 2018 or so. And essentially since then, they haven't really been able to issue bonds. And they've also been squeezed on bank financing as well. And so what you tended to find was as these firms recognized that they needed to keep growing as fast as they could, and that basically anyone small would fail or get swallowed up, they just pushed more and more into using non-debt liabilities instead, which is pre-sales, but it's also extending the terms of payment to suppliers. They just wouldn't pay them for ages and ages. So you get all of these various kinds of non-interest bearing non-debt liabilities that private firms have really been relying on. And so since 2018, the ratio of non-debt liabilities to equity has been extremely high, particularly for private developers, and just hasn't really fallen, even as the debt to equity ratio has fallen pretty decently, actually. We're back to sort of levels that you saw about a decade ago. Yeah. And that makes the sector as a whole look healthier, but it just isn't true because of all of these other forms. Outside the real estate sector is interesting because there the problem is much more of an SOE issue. And so in government policy pronouncements, one of the things that you've seen for the past 3 or 4 years, definitely 3 years, has been this emphasis on local governments and SOEs paying their suppliers, because they've been using their size and influence market power to delay payments to suppliers as well. And so you have this very large, probably in the tune of 8 to 10 trillion RMB that are just owed by SOEs to smaller firms in the economy, that represents a very significant drain on liquidity for SMEs and private sector. So those are your two kinds of non-debt liability problem that China has, and they're both extremely hard to unwind.
Coming back to the sort of high-level look at this, again, if I were looking at this chart you have on page 4, which is looking at the debt-to-equity ratio for non-financial firms by sector, and as you say, this is the one that shows basically pretty consistent, aggressive, linear growth in debt-to-equity ratio in the real estate sector until about 2018. And indeed, we saw some policies put in place by Beijing in 2020, the sort of three red lines, clearly signaling that they saw leverage in the real estate sector as problematic. I look at this chart and I'm disassociated from the current economic news, let's imagine, and I would say this is a success story, right? This is, for a long time, there's been significant criticism, including by external analysts, about leverage building in the system. And of course, it was rampant in real estate. What went wrong here, especially knowing that this was, in some sense, especially when the 3 red line policies was put into place in, I forget when that was, summer of 2020, the wrong time, basically. But nonetheless, when it was put in place, did Beijing move too early and aggressively to deleverage at precisely the wrong moment, i.e., when COVID was coming and the country was moving into full lockdown, which was going to seize up the real estate sector anyway? If you were advising, if you had a time machine and you were going back to 2018, what would have been the path to deleverage more sustainably?
Yeah, so I think there were 2 gambles basically that were made in 2020 that worked for a little while and then they didn't work really catastrophically. The first gamble was basically that, and I think the timing is not terrible. So they're looking at the world, and seeing that China at that point is actually dealing with COVID really well. The zero COVID policy worked pretty fantastically. So I was there through the whole period, and we had about a month or so, maybe 6 weeks of pretty hard lockdown at the beginning, after which life really went back basically to normal and continued that way through basically the start of 2022. And so you had a situation where the Chinese government was feeling, okay, well, we're handling COVID really well. And actually at the same time, our exports are going completely gangbusters because everyone in the rest of the world is having these terrible supply chain issues and production halts. And so people are just going to buy stuff from us indefinitely. And they really did. That export boom lasted quite a long while. And even though the growth has kind of slowed significantly and it's shrinking in nominal terms now, in volume terms, it's still way above where we were pre-pandemic, which is basically until COVID hit was really, you wouldn't have guessed, given that we were in the midst of the US tariff situation. There wasn't an expectation that exports was going to be a strong, healthy driver of growth. So you had both of those things going on. They felt like the domestic economy was fine because they'd handled COVID, no problem, and they were crowing about it from every rooftop. And at the same time, they had this big export boom. So they thought to themselves, okay, this is actually a great time to kind of push the pace on deleveraging for the property sector. The problem was, of course, that exports didn't last forever. And then you had 2022, these very big, very disruptive lockdowns that really shook economic growth and household confidence. And at that point, what had happened in basically at the end of every other property downturn that I suspect that they expected would happen again is that they really viewed household ebullience on the property front as being like a beach ball that, the hard work was pushing it underwater. But as soon as you kind of let your hand off a little bit, it would pop back out and the market would rush up again. And so they figured they were doing the difficult work. And if they needed to, they'd just do that again. And it turned out not to be true, that there was some like elastic limit or buoyancy limit to household confidence and willingness to participate that basically hit the skids at the point that property developers started getting in real bad situation and entering this project stalling downward spiral. And so I didn't think that they really expected that to happen. And so the combination of all of those things together is what kind of made these gambles really fail in a catastrophic fashion.
Let's move to shock 3, which is the shock to corporate's ability to raise capital. And the first is to talk about, and maybe this is where geopolitics comes into it, but this is both an onshore and an offshore problem for companies. Maybe talk about the offshore piece first. What's different now about the ability of a given Chinese firm, their ability to raise capital from offshore investors? What's changed and how significant is the change?
Sure. You've got a number of things going on, but it's basically a US-China story, and it's basically a function of regulatory tightening on both sides of the Pacific, creating an environment in which that fed into itself and in which investors have just proved extremely loath to put any significant money into new stocks. So the first part of this was a combination that happened at basically the same time of the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act passing in the US at the end of 2020. And at the same time, the Alibaba, so the Ant Group IPO getting nixed at the last minute, followed early in 2020 by some pretty large fines on Baba and stern warnings to the rest of the sector. All of that, I think, could have been contained. And actually, internet platform prices continued rising through January, even after these kind of initial sparks. The big kind of real catalyst moment was the DD IPO, and you can sort of see things falling off really fast after that. I think there was the perception certainly amongst the DD management that this was kind of business as usual, and it's a cat and mouse game with domestic regulators, and you kind of push them as much as you can, then they push back a little bit. But at the end of the day, we're fast and we're smart, and we'll stay ahead of the bureaucrats. And that turned out to be absolutely, a real mistaking of the temperature, basically. And so Cyberspace Administration, which had been the kind of more aggressive regulatory entity up to that point, just felt extremely kind of enabled and empowered by the clear anger of the top leadership at this just complete disregard for the policy line that was being kind of pushed by Beijing. And then it was just pile-on zone. So every regulatory body in the country just felt, if we're going to stay on Xi Jinping's good side, we need to hit these guys as hard as we possibly can. And it's the talk of spiritual pollution in gaming, the the ed tech sector getting completely smashed. So that's the period. And so at the same time, you have running this complete destruction of complete destruction of certain parts of the onshore tech sector, and very, very significant trammeling of the prospects of other parts from a whole range of directions. And your best case scenario as an investor at that point looking in was that, okay, well, the growth prospects for these firms are going to be quite significantly lower than we had expected them to be. Worst case scenario is you were worried that, okay, well, there's going to be some kind of nationalization, or there's going to be, that these guys are going to go the same way as the ed tech sector, and just the complete industry destruction. That was always, those kind of apocalyptic expectations were always, I think, over-egging the pudding somewhat. The first of those two prospects always seemed to us to be the most likely, just because, large sections of the e-commerce sphere are considered to be really important by Chinese government, particularly during pandemic when people were stuck at home. But in any case, you've got that going on. And then at the same time, you have this ticking time clock of the delisting from the US angle. And so this is all kind of going on and playing out. And as a consequence, you basically get a complete hiatus in any kind of large scale listing of Chinese firms in the US. Hong Kong kind of survives a bit longer, and you still get some listings down there. But over time, particularly at the moment where you get this kind of second massive catalyst, which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the perceptions that China is hewing way, way too close for comfort towards support, military and otherwise, to Russia in a way which could put them into the box of just the kind of complete financial sanctioning that Russian assets suffered. So those things all together were this kind of rolling snowball, which over time just got people really, really worried about the prospects for Chinese financial assets, both in their kind of internal earnings generation possibility going forwards, but then maybe more important in the potential for, just the US government telling investors, you cannot hold these assets, either explicitly or for a lot of firms, and this is particularly true for kind of public pension firms, like teachers, those kinds of things, where there's just this very large potential reputational risk if they have significant exposure to China. Things go wrong, and then they just look like not only total idiots but traitors.
I know your data only extends into 2022, so this is a little bit prognostic. But PCAOB reached an agreement, a tentative initial agreement that forestalls the mass delisting of Chinese corporates. China has been raising I don't know if it's the Beijing has been raising not the white flag, but at least has been sending out vibes to the private sector that we're done with the unilateral punitive actions against the private sector and the tech sector in particular. How much do you think, given what you just laid out as a case for what led to or contributed to some of this challenges in fundraising, what do you think a truce or détente on the delisting and China at least trying to say, we're not coming for you anymore, private sector tech companies, does that change the trajectory of this story?
No, unfortunately not. So the data so far this year shows almost no fundraising in Hong Kong or US and public markets, and VC and PE flows, which is the other significant part of this story, have dropped to basically zero as well. So in part, that's because you have these, as of the end of March, we have these new regulations on overseas listing, which require any company that wants to list overseas has to go through CSRC and then also get the permission of any other relevant regulatory body, which, if you are the kind of firm which is interesting to foreign investors, you probably are somewhat consumer related, and you probably have a pretty big information dimension, let's call it, whether it's AI or sort of consumer finance, any sort of consumer thing where your profitability basically relies on knowing your customers in a way which honestly most of us would be uncomfortable with, right? So it's the kind of companies which are dealing with large amounts of data to a degree which makes them attractive, are also the companies which are treading very close, in a lot of cases, towards national security lines, which remain extremely blurry and dangerous. China's focus on national security continues to tighten. and secrecy. And at the same time that they're making these overtures of friendliness to the private sector in general, we've had these multiple stories of raids on offices in Shanghai in particular, major global and US institutions. And so essentially at this point, as of my latest temperature taking from the chambers of commerce and such, there's just not a lot of confidence. They don't really believe what they're being told. And even if they do, the domestic management of these companies believe what they're being told, they just can't sell a positive China story to the global boards.
Yeah. What's the picture for state-owned enterprises?
So SOEs never really relied on overseas funding. So they've just continued to raise capital pretty happily on domestic markets. And they have better access to bank financing too. So it hasn't been such a big problem for SOEs. This has really been a private sector issue.
Let's move to shock number 4, which is the intensification of industrial policy. You laid out, when I asked you earlier for just high-level summary of this, you mentioned some of this, but I wonder if you can go a little bit more in depth into this, which is what's changed since 2020? How focused are Beijing's efforts to steer capital, and what are the means by which this capital is finding its way into capital goods and tech hardware? Is this policy signals? Is this spontaneous action by investors who just understand where green light, yellow light, red lights are in terms of Beijing's preference? So how big is the magnitude of this shift, and by what mechanisms is this capital moving from some industries to others?
Yeah. So generally when people, and particularly sort of the more government-associated think tanks talk about Chinese industrial policy, historically it's always focused on subsidies, explicit government subsidies. And if you look at the kind of quantities on that front, you can see that capital goods and tech hardware receive somewhere north of about 2.5% of gross profit in explicit government subsidies. This is the 6,000 company sample, which is significant and pretty significant in terms of ROA and ROE, but it's small in the grand scheme of things. Compared to other sectors would be much, much less. So we're talking less than 1% for energy, infrastructure, real estate, consumer goods and services sitting kind of somewhere in the middle. So the subsidy story definitely paints the picture of a strong preference for capital goods and tech hardware that moves the needle to some degree, but which isn't necessarily, it doesn't constitute, we're talking a few 100 billion RMB rather than trillions. So it's important, but it's more important than anything as a kind of signaling mechanism and a returns boosting mechanism, which then creates a reality that private investors can respond to. The second and probably more important element in this governmental industrial preference is tax rate. So real estate industry has historically paid somewhere between 40 and 50% of gross profit in net taxes and fees. Energy and materials around 30%. Consumer goods and services somewhere around 15%, and then capital goods and tech hardware as of 2022 less than 10%. So the corporate tax rate is supposed to be about 25% for kind of general reference. So there's this very, very strong kind of preferential tax policies that are all associated with strategic emerging industries and companies getting these sweetheart deals. Semiconductor sector, just for reference, pays, I think, 0 in net terms, maybe even a little bit less than 0. And so if you put these things together, you have subsidies equivalent to, maybe 2.5% of gross profit. And then these very, very substantial tax savings. What you get at the other end is a picture of return on assets and return on invested capital, which is very favorable to the kind of sectors which Beijing wants to encourage. So then when we get to talking about the kind of rationality of capital allocation and distribution in China, and you're thinking about, how much capital are firms getting relative to their apparent relative performance, it actually looks pretty decent. The problem is that relative performance kind of landscape has been quite significantly distorted by government intervention to begin with.
You imagine, though, if I were a policymaker in Beijing and I was looking at pages 6 and 7 of this report, which for the audience is the one where you lay out the subsidy piece, but then the charts on page 7 are looking at which sectors dominate capital markets or which are doing where the movement is in the capital markets.
Mm-hmm.
This is exactly the story I would want if I were Xi Jinping, which is we're seeing a movement from capital raised by non-listed financial firms increasingly going to tech hardware, 25% versus 19% a year ago. And then hold on a second, I'm going to read from the second one, which I think is in 2022 alone. Tech hardware sectors dominated onshore IPOs, 43% of all funds raised in 2022. So maybe just trying to segue this industrial policy conversation to the big so what's. I guess my first so what question to you is, this is a success case for Xi Jinping, right? I think we've all intuited that his general critique of spontaneous market mechanisms as capital, aggregators and channelers is there's no assurance that they go to the quote unquote right strategic sectors that are needed to overcome productivity challenges and increasingly to fight China's way through what they see as an embargo strategy from the United States. So given what you've just demonstrated here, and also if you look at, as you mentioned, a lot of this capital is moving into firms that have, higher returns on invested capital. So question number one is, why is this not a good thing, or at least from Xi Jinping's perspective?
Yeah, to some degree it is. So if we look at some of the successes, or let's say the most notable success of the Chinese economy this year, the brightest spot has been electric vehicle production. So you have this very rapid replacement in domestic sales of internal combustion engine vehicles with EVs that have gone from somewhere in the 5 to 10% of car sales a couple of years ago to we're now approaching 30+%. Incredibly fast and very impressive phenomenon. And at the same time, shipping probably something like 500,000 of these vehicles a month out to export markets. That's a real, a triumph of industrial policy there. You could also make the same case for solar panels, other battery technology, right? So all of this stuff has been extremely successful. As a supply side policy, it's done really well. The problem is that you can get to a point where your level of supply has left demand so far behind that you encounter some pretty significant problems. And so they just don't really think about the economy in the kind of Keynesian terms that generally the rest of the world thinks about it, where you do need to worry about aggregate demand at the same time as you're worrying about supply. China essentially thinks about it as supply creates its own demand. Don't worry about it. Just keep pumping it into the right places and we'll all be fine. The sign that that's not working is the kind of plunge into deflationary territory that we've seen this year. And that is kind of inevitable if one of your three major sources of demand, i.e. the property sector, is in the kind of straits that it is. That will only get worse as we talked before, of the linkages into household income and consumption too. So it has worked to some degree, but it's just outpaced the demand side of the economy to a degree which just creates this big overhang of potential crisis in which it's fine you being able to produce all of the electric vehicles and advanced chips and things in the world, but you do need someone to buy them at the end of the day. And there is a danger that households are going to be unable to do that, whilst at the same time China's relationship with major trading partners has deteriorated, particularly with the United States, to a degree that, so for instance, there are apparently punitive tariffs coming on transshipped solar panel shipments from Southeast Asia and the other countries that China's been shipping panels through to avoid the Xinjiang restrictions. And so as other countries get more and more annoyed by China and smarter at figuring out these indirect routes of import, you have trouble of external demand as well. So that's the challenge. So you could say, to some degree, it's worked great as industrial policy, but that does have to fit into a broader conception of the economy that takes demand and supply into account.
The second so what, and maybe the final so what, and this is actually just a point you made in the slide deck, but I'll frame it as a question, which is to Xi Jinping's view that, well, this is working. And if we could link together now the current state of the real estate market and the likely declining share of economic activity that's going to encompass, and this movement towards hard tech capital goods. One of the points you make, which I just ask if you could re-summarize it and then draw it out a bit, which is the real estate sector was so large, and these strategic and emerging industries aren't nearly sizable enough to be able to replace the role of the real estate sector. Can you frame that more succinctly than I just did and talk about why that is such an important challenge for management of China's political economy?
Yeah, so the challenge is basically that you have this, one of the charts on here shows the 12-month rolling sum of fixed asset investment in the statistics. And you have real estate investment running at somewhere around 17.5 trillion RMB. And then you have, even after a very significant increase in investment by capital goods and tech hardware firms, it's running around 10 trillion. And so far, the decline in real estate investment has come down by 2, 3, maybe even approaching, probably 2 or 3 trillion on a rolling basis. But that's going to get significantly worse if the problem is not addressed. If we see it drop by half, which is what sales and starts are doing right now, then you have a decline in real estate investment, which is basically almost equivalent to the entirety of investment by the capital goods and tech hardware sector. So you would need that sector to double in order to make up the slack. And to some degree, you can patch some of this over with infrastructure investment. The problem with that is that the local government fiscal position is so closely linked to real estate sales and land sales that we're already seeing a bit of fiscal contraction from local governments this year, even in the face of all of these problems, basically because they just don't have very much money left. And so the central government can exhort and push them to borrow more through special purpose bond issuance. But if their general financial position is so stressed and strained by the fact that there've been a lot of tax cuts offered to firms, either originally to try and get them into their local area as this kind of part of this jockeying and competition, and then more recently as part of the last two years of quite aggressive fiscal loosening by cutting tax rates on firms, that there's just not very much left in the cupboard. And so consequently, there's a risk that any liquidity which is made available by central government through these special purpose bond quotas in particular to local government will just get sucked into filling gaps. And consequently, if you have a situation where real estate is suffering that badly, it's going to be very, very difficult to sustain high rates of infrastructure investment growth without the central government taking on large amounts of new debt, which they have proven to be very loath to do. So that's the problem. It's just a simple kind of arithmetic of aggregate demand and the fact that real estate is so big that you could really struggle to fill that gap if it opens up in the way which it really looks to be doing this yet.
Final question. 3 years from now, you're doing an update on this report. What's your guess on what the top line story is going to be? It's a totally unfair question, but this feels like such an awkward moment to try to make assumptions about China because all the plates are spinning right now in ways that are confusing. And even the heuristics we normally use for the ability of policymakers to yet again swoop in and sort of sort it all out or pave it over or kick the can. Clearly, there's a lot of, there are areas where there's lots of ammunition left to do that. If the leadership showed acute awareness of how bad the problem was, especially Xi Jinping, and decided that the prioritization was economic stability. But I can't tell in the relative weighting. My sense is Xi Jinping is probably thinking, we're going to hit the growth target, and we're gearing up for intensified geopolitical struggle with the United States. So we've got to be able to China's own version of walk and chew gum at the same time. But nonetheless, it's very confusing. Is it as confusing for you? And where do you think this will be in a few years?
Oh, it's undoubtedly a confusing subject. So like let's say a 3-year time horizon, that takes us through 2026. So there are a number of scenarios that you could imagine. One of which is that as a consequence of that things get significantly worse this year and that property sector just continues to fall apart, and that at some point in the hopefully next couple of months, that shocks them into a kind of realization that this kind of this overly ideological mode in which they've kind of straitjacketed themselves is at risk of destroying or undermining the really important policy priorities which they legitimately and sincerely hold about making people's lives better and making China kind of secure and resilient against external pressure. And so they, even, kind of in the midst of all of some of the illusions that we built around themselves, recognize that they do need to grow at a certain pace to achieve that there needs to be sufficient employment. And so consequently, the hope would be that they realize that soon enough to put a sufficient floor under the potential risks in the property sector, which would involve probably some degree of, at this point, some degree of guarantee to that developers are not going to go bust and that home buyers, don't worry, you will get the houses that you're buying, combined probably with some kind of pretty sizable fiscal stimulus. So that would be the positive version. In that scenario, what you would hope would be we get a little bit of improvement in external demand going into next year, that they manage to kind of get property sales running at around a more sustainable level, which is still much lower than 2019, but is higher by some degree than we're at today. And that the property firms, given this kind of safety margin and guarantee, are able to basically just keep things ticking over while shrinking their balance sheet. In that scenario, and I think basically in any scenario, the amount of capital and support going to capital goods firms and tech hardware firms continues to increase as a proportion of economic activity. In the kind of downside scenario, it would increase even faster, not because they're getting more resources, but because everything else is falling apart at the seams. So I think it is, if we don't see more urgent and muscular central government response to this crisis, there is a distinct possibility of growth falling to basically nothing into next year and staying there for a significant period of time, just because all of your negative feedback loops basically kick into effect. People's wages aren't growing, they just stick everything in the bank. Consumption falls very significantly. That sort of scenario, the kind of doom loop. So that's the kind of the downside scenario, not only because of the potential consequences domestically for China and for people's livelihoods and for the global demand, but because that is also the sort of scenario historically that we've tended to see particularly autocratic states act in extremely aggressive ways on the international stage. And there are plenty of actors on the Chinese side, and sad to say probably on the US side as well, who are kind of shifting into a position where they quite welcome a conflict